great night in beautiful Upper Platte Valley and had an opportunity to travel around and see some of the area and spend a little money and help the economy out here, and perhaps whetted your appetite so that you bring your families back sometime and spend an extended time in the valley. If you didn't get a chance to drive up the road 20 miles south of here, go to encampment, make sure you do that sometime. All right, we have a full agenda today, and I'm sure everyone's going to be anxious to get home in a timely fashion. So brevity is always appreciated. We don't want to limit anyone's opportunity to comment or to vet our topics thoroughly, but we also need to be respectful of the time. Looks like our first item on the agenda today is the K-3 reading assessment and intervention. And I don't have my glasses, so I might have to have somebody else interpret for me here this morning. It looks like Matt is up first. So,
Chairman Paxton, before we begin, would you like me to take the roll?
oh yeah, let's do that.
All right, sir. Senator Ellis. Senator Beitman. Senator Salazar. Senator Rothfuss. Representative Andrew. Representative Brown. Representative Connolly. Representative Harshman. Representative Nyman.
Here.
Representative Newsom. Representative Obermueller. Representative Summers.
Here.
Co-Chairman Scott.
Here.
Co-Chairman Paxton.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Matt, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Good morning again. Today, the first item on your agenda is providing you some background on your number one priority, which is related to early childhood literacy and kindergarten readiness. This issue brief in your packet behind the K-3 reading assessment intervention tab was put together by LSO to provide the committee background on this program that was established during the 2001 general session to primarily improve student proficiency in reading in grades K through 3. After my presentation, the Department of Education will follow with more of the programmatic implementation side of it. This presentation is just intended to give you some background on what the legislature has done since 2001 and provide you additional resources that we found putting this together. As indicated in 2001, the legislature enacted Wyoming Statute 213401, which is the Reading Assessment Intervention Program. And the primary purpose was improving K through 3, K2 reading, K through 2 reading, requiring each school district to implement and assess students' reading progress in grades 1 and 2 and track that over a longitudinal period and align those programs to your statewide educational program as we discussed yesterday. Each district was required to, after identifying students that needed assistance in their reading proficiency, either put them on an individual reading plan or if they're already on a individualized education plan, track those students' reading progress and report the proficiency of those students back to the Department of Education. The initial program required at least 85% of the students identified in needing reading proficiency to reach those, at least 85% to reach proficiency in reading. That's a little bit of a nuance. In the beginning of the program, it was only speaking towards those students that were identified. The goal was to have 85% of those students at reading proficiency by the time they reached 4th grade. If that goal was not met, districts then were required to file a report with the Department of Education and provide a plan to meet that goal. In 2009, the legislature's Management Audit Committee had a scoping paper authored by the LSO's program evaluation section to, it really is a legislative response on concerns that the program wasn't being implemented and monitored appropriately. In 2010, an evaluation report was issued, and several findings and recommendations were provided to the legislature on how to improve the program. As I indicated, the legislature created this in 2001. Part of the evaluation report identified that Wyoming was one of 37 states to implement a similar program across their states, and this was primarily in response to a national report on reading programs. And so Wyoming was one of 37 states at that time in 2010 that had a K-3 or early literacy program. As part of this issue brief, we looked for information, more up-to-date information, and found a September 2020 issue paper from the Education Commission on the States on current policies in other states. Within that issue brief from ECS, one of the products that they cite is a 2011 Annie-EKC Foundation report that indicates if students don't achieve proficiency in reading by grade 4 or by 3rd grade, they are 4 times more likely to leave school without a high school diploma. So I'll get into the statutory amendments on page 2. They are also contained in your Appendix B. That ECS issue brief as well is Appendix C in this issue brief. So in response to your 2010 program evaluation report, there were a few changes that the legislature made in the 2011 general session. The first of which is the program initially was targeted for grades K-2 in schools. It expanded it to grades K-3 to have that screening program each of the districts go through K-3. The second change was the Department of Education was granted the authority to approve all the reading assessments, plans, and screening instruments that districts implemented. So that was primarily a function of the districts prior to 2011. The legislature then gave the superintendent the authority. That was further changed in 2019, and I'll highlight that in a few minutes. Another change in the 2011 was, 2011 was to require each district's program to be research or evidence-based interventions used to improve student proficiency. And then as I opened up the 85% goal was not what was changed to not just only target those that were identified as needing reading interventions, but the goal now is changed to 85% of all students in the district by the end of grade 3 should be reading at proficiency levels. And then the report back to the Department of Education provided more specificity on what types of interventions that districts were using, including student-teacher ratios, use of certified tutors, instruction facilitators that were resourced in the block grant model. One other thing I glossed over on the bottom of page 1 is prior to the 2005 recalibration, when the legislature initiated this program, it was funded as what we call a categorical grant. So it was a separate funding stream outside of your block grant formula. In the 2005 recalibration, the resources for this program were embedded into the block grant funding model. One of the findings in your program evaluation report was before the 2005 recalibration, districts were required to report the expenditures related to that categorical grant. When it was embedded into the block grant model, the transparency on what those expenditures were on was eliminated. And this kind of gets back to the virtual education discussion yesterday. When you embed programs within the block grant, it becomes very difficult to identify exactly what resources are being targeted for a reading intervention program, virtual education program, because a tutor is a tutor. It could be used for this K-3 reading program or other programs. Just wanted to touch on that. Sorry to gloss over that earlier. In the 2012 session, the legislature made a few other amendments. The first was related to specifically identifying dyslexia as one of the required learning disabilities to be measured through the reading screening program. It also authorized the Department of Education to promulgate rules and regulations related to the program if necessary. The Department of Education has not done any rules related to this program to date. They do have a guidance document, and they actually updated it last week for school districts. And that is hyperlinked within your memo. We can get you copies of that if you are in need of one. And then the final amendments to this program occurred in the 2019 session. And the authority for the Department of Education to approve these screening programs was eliminated, and it was provided back to the school districts. But more prescriptive requirements of that reading program were embedded within the statute, and those are on the third bullet on page 3 under the 2019 journal session heading. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll just briefly discuss assessment results. One of the additional findings in the program evaluation report was, since students who can be identified either on an individualized reading plan or using their individualized education plan, these results of these students being tracked isn't publicly reported. So, and they still are not publicly reported as a subgroup within the statewide assessment system. So it's difficult to identify, at least in a public report, on the progress of these students. So what we've done for purposes of this issue brief is provide a snapshot using the statewide summative assessment results, and then also the Federal National Assessment of Education Progress, which is administered by the U.S. Department of Education. Using the statewide summative assessment, we use the PAWS and the YTOP results, and we discussed those statewide assessments yesterday. On page 4 in table 1, we've identified the proficiency of or advanced percentages of students in reading and language arts. School years 2005-06 through 2016-17 uses the PAWS results. PAWS specifically reported results on reading. YTOP in the 2017-18 and 2018-19 school years is more broadly English language arts. So the results of these percentages don't yield a 85% proficiency of students reading proficiency at the 85% goal. The highest in grade 4 was in 2010-11, where students in 4th grade were at 83.6%, but it's varied pretty dramatically over the past 15 years. The more stable assessment has been the NAEP, since that's been administered on a much longer time series and hasn't changed assessments. And that is in figures 1 and figure 2 for grades 4 and 8. Wyoming has performed better than the national average, but the percentage has been much lower than what has been demonstrated on the statewide summative assessment. Finally, the Department of Education was awarded a substantial grant from the U.S. Department of Education called the Striving Readers Comprehensive Literacy Grant. And this was awarded in 2021. The total grant over 5 years is approximately $43.3 million. In the first year that begins this year is $8.3 million. I'll let the Department of Education expand upon that with the committee this morning. But with that, Mr. Chairman, that's kind of an introduction of this topic and the program that the legislature has established.
Co-Chair Scott.
if I may, let me elaborate a little on this. Since the original bill was actually a bill I sponsored. The original program was not based on legislation in any other state. And I don't know where it fits into all the other states that have a similar program, whether we were early or late, or what the relationship was. What happened was it's based on a program in a school district in Arkansas that was doing this program and came to a National School Boards Association meeting that I happened to attend, really as a spouse, because my wife was on the school board. And they reported on this program, and they were achieving very good results. It was well over the 85% we set as a goal. It was well up in the 90s, Mr. Chairman. And the reason it's K through 2 is that's what they were doing. I went and listened to the presentation and said, this is something we ought to do, came back and wrote the bill based on what they were doing in that Arkansas district. Basically the theory was that reading was taught on what works best for the majority of the students, the most students. But there's a significant minority that learns how to read in other ways. And that's where your people that are not learning how to read successfully in the early grades are coming from. They have this side or the other problem that prevents them from learning, and maybe they just need a different style of instruction. But the Arkansas people said you had to identify what was causing each kid's problem and remedy that. And that's what the thing was designed to do. And they said that really the design of the public school systems is kids are reading essentially effectively by the end of second grade, and third grade is for catching up those that don't learn in the first 2 grades. And after that, there's an assumption, Mr. Chairman, that the kid knows how to read, and the rest of schooling is based on that. So you've got to get them reading in those early grades. And that was the philosophy. The 85% figure, I think, was heavily debated. We were clearly a good deal less than that. And we wanted something that would challenge the districts, but not be impossible. And so as I remember, we debated that figure on the floor of the Senate considerably in the process of passing that. So that, Mr. Chairman, is a little background on the origin of that. I will say, and I'll have a number of questions when I get to State Department of Education. I'm disappointed we're not achieving the level of results that I think we ought to, and I think we need to ask why.
Okay, thank you for the background lesson. Anyone else? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one point of clarification on table number 1 on page number 4. It shows there on the 11th graders, yeah, a dramatic drop in the proficiency rate between 2013 and 14, I believe it is here. Let's see, 2013 and 2014. Just an anomaly or what? Because we dropped to less than half proficiency on our 11th graders. Did they lose their ability to read because they were proficient before that at a greater level than what it showed? I'm just curious as what would be the reason for that dramatic decline and consistent decline?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Nyman, I'll defer to the department if I screw this up, but I believe, if you remember yesterday, the State Department of Education adopted new English language arts standards in 2012, and I believe those standards, those were more rigorous than the prior standards, and cut scores were changed as part of the measuring of those results on the statewide summative assessment. I think that's the result of changing of standards. I could be wrong, but I'll defer to the Department of Education if I screw that up.
Yes, okay. Senator, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to the question, honestly, table 1 variations are more of an effect of re-standardizing and changing the tests and changing what a proficient or advanced score is than it is of any effects, unfortunately. Something that we talked a lot about in the education accountability was that we really can't draw any conclusions from the data we have to date because we changed the tests and scores and cut scores so often our data was functionally useless. And that was one of the reasons why we switched to Y-top and then theoretically are going to try and hold to that. So moving forward, in theory, assuming a future legislature or a future group doesn't come along and change it once again, which they're certainly empowered to, we should hopefully have better data. When you look, however, at why is that? Oh, table 1 versus figure 1. Okay, figure 1 is NAEP testing and figure 2 is NAEP testing. NAEP goes to great lengths to maintain commonality from year to year, and those tests weren't changed. So you can see trends there that would be meaningful trends from year to year of minor improvement that you can see, for example, on figure 1 and figure 2. Actually, kind of begs the question what happened in 2019, but that's a more accurate statistically approach to this evaluation. And then, Mr. Chairman, the final thing I would note is back to table 1, we set what is considered to be proficient and advanced typically through a professional judgment panel where they say these are the things that we believe are. Much like NAEP uses their own or used their own a while ago professional judgment panel of what they think is proficient and advanced. So you can see that nationally on the NAEP scores, less than a third of the states, less than a third of, well, the average for states is what I should say, is less than a third proficient or advanced because it's an incredibly rigorous standard. Massachusetts, which is typically number 1 in 4th grade reading, only gets a few points above where we are. And I believe on 2019, we're 4th or 5th in the country in terms of those scores. So it's important to kind of have context of the meaning of those scores. And while we want those numbers to go up, nobody has ever achieved 85% proficient or advanced on the NAEP. That's never happened. Nobody's scored 50% proficient advanced on the NAEP. So it all depends on what you call an A, right? If an A is a 99, not as many people get it. If an A is a 70, well, you can get a lot of people getting an A. So I just wanted to provide that context, a little bit of background for those that weren't involved with the accountability over the years, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, thanks for this. If I remember, our topic for the interim is kindergarten readiness and early literacy, something along those lines. And what you gave us is a good overview of what we've done so far in terms of statutory changes over the year in an attempt to increase kindergarten readiness and early literacy. I'm curious if you have the information off the top of your head about how districts or schools are actually attempting to kind of achieve kind of that broader goal. Because we know we don't have standardized support, for example, but there's TANF, there's Head Start, there's some districts that actually have an early childhood program within their brick and mortar school. So could you give us a bit of an overview?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conley, I don't know that I possess that expertise this morning. I'll have to do some more research, and maybe the Department of Education can touch on that when they come up here. It probably varies amongst all the districts, whether they're assessing students when they get in kindergarten on what their needs are at that point and how they're implementing any interventions when they step in the classrooms in kindergarten or first, second grade. I just don't possess that expertise this morning. You are correct. Some districts do have pre-K programs or kinder boost programs that actually are kindergarten age students. and they fund those programs with a combination of state and federal dollars. But I'll have to defer, like I said, at the Department of Education. We can certainly come back in September and provide the committee more details if that's desired of the committee.
Since we're talking about the kindergarten readiness thing, I have two daughters that are either kindergartner teachers or have been kindergarten teachers. And so I get a lot of feedback from them. And when I asked them about this topic, they both agreed that the first thing, when you start at the very beginning and we're looking at reading, the readiness factor is the biggest thing for them. And they're both of the mind that we should have either higher standards for a readiness test or evaluation or statewide readiness. And I'm looking at it also from an economic standpoint of when we have to retain a child in kindergarten, it's a very traumatic experience for a lot of parents and for a lot of kids. And it's also an expense to the state of Wyoming to educate kids for 14 for an extra year. And so to me, if we were going to do one thing, the very first place we would start would be to look at the kindergarten readiness thing. And it really, everybody matures at a different level. And some kids just aren't ready to learn the kind of things that we need to learn from a maturity standpoint. And the second thing they tell me that regardless of what program the districts have adopted to teach reading, it all goes back to the knowledge and creativity of the teacher. Every program that they've ever used, and they've used several programs, requires some kind of supplemental materials to be able to be used with that and in conjunction with that. And their thinking is that if there's one thing that could really help would be to use, if there's one place where an instructional facilitator would be the most useful, it would be to help those kindergarten, first, second grade teachers in the area of reading. So just some personal comments from my kids who have actually worked in the trenches for a number of years. Anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You touched on something that I think it's pretty critical for the rest of the committee, that we tackled this a few years ago and started this discussion a few years ago. But one of the things that came out of that discussion 2 or 3 years ago was there was a big discussion surrounding how teachers are taught how to teach and whether or not teachers are being taught how to teach reading. And what we learned through that process was, at least at our university, that was not the case. We did not have a definitive program put in place for our K-3 teachers coming out of college and expecting them to know how to teach reading to these underdeveloped students. And so that was probably one of the biggest key issues that I noticed in that entire discussion was, if we don't have teachers that know how to teach, how do we expect the students how to learn? And so I think that's going to be one of the bigger things. And I think we'll hear from a few people today in regards to that. But, as you said, it really depends upon the individualized practice of the teachers and how they implement these special techniques that they may find. But one of the other things that I think is important for us to notice is, I think Senator Roth has said it perfectly. We've got a basket of fruit and we can't really compare any of them to find out what in the world we've actually done with reading. We're not comparing apples and oranges. We've got limes and kiwis and everything in there. We need to get a standardized assessment that's really going to be focused on being able to compare these reading scores across the board. NAEP is the closest thing that we have, but as Senator Roth has pointed out, it's such a stringent standard that when we put 85% in there and we have anybody who looks at our standard and then we put that compared to NAEP, it's very easy to draw criticism. So what we actually need to do is we need to have a more standardized approach. And I think that there's probably going to be some people here today that will testify to that. But those are the two biggest areas that I see that we need to focus on as we move forward with this, is really focusing at the university level and working with our teachers, whether that's through some sort of a program that verifies that they know how to teach reading And number two is making sure that we are comparing apples to apples as we move forward.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Matt, you know, as we went through recalibration, some of the things that were going on in my head were how do we, this issue was in my head, K through 3. How do we handle it? You know, should we take resources that are in the block grant and make them categorical again? And so one thing you said is we put some of this stuff back in the block grant instead of it being categorical. And so we really don't know how that's being used. So, you know, one thing I was hoping maybe you could get for us is just kind of, you know, what is that? What's the dollar figure? You know, what does that look like? The other thing that I've thought about, and I know districts won't like it, but I'm saying this so I get input from, is, you know, what if in K3 we mandate the class size? We just take it out categorically. We say it's really important in these grades that you have these low class sizes. Not a recommendation, but a mandate. The challenge is facilities, right? We've been down that path before. And so how do we handle that? So that's a question I kind of want answered. And then I think the IF thing, that was one of the others that I rolled around in my head during recalibration on this K through 3 is you know, if we took a look, and this would be something you'd have to take a look at, but how many, you know, how much do we resource for IFs? And, you know, what would be the percentage, you know, so you got K through 3. So, you know, that's 4 out of the 12, 4 out of the 13 grades, you know, so how do we ensure maybe that IFs are being put towards reading and put towards this grade group? And so if we carved off a piece of that and went back to categorical strictly for this purpose, that's something else I would like to look at, just kind of run through. So those are some things that I would like to see maybe get a little data on as we move forward.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, very difficult to identify specific amounts within your block grant for this purpose, as indicated. There are many strategies embedded within your formula on how to improve student outcomes. Class sizes being the most expensive part of that. Your elementary class sizes are at 16. Your consultants recommended primarily the K through 3 band at 15. So you're slightly larger than what your consultants have recommended, but there are various other resources and strategies embedded within your formula to address student interventions. Reading one of those. They are tutors, summer school, extended day, professional development, instructor facilitators. The additional complexity with that is your formula has minimum resources built in. So you receive a minimum level of instruction facilitators, a minimum level of tutors, minimum number of teachers in a building. And so trying to identify a certain percentage or fractional amount that would go towards just this specific program becomes difficult to do. I think what you've done in your statute is created a program with with requirements of districts identifying those students and their reading problems and requiring those students to be provided interventions in a manner that address their specific reading problems. Trying to target your block grant becomes, like I said, complex at best.
Scott. Mr. Chairman. Further on that point, I think it's important to realize that what you're talking about is one of the fundamental duties of your K-12 system in terms of teaching reading. And there were considerable resources when this was passed, already devoted to the subject, of trying to get all the kids learning how to read. And the appropriation that came with this in no way tried to capture all the resources that were available because it was so much a part of the fundamental job. What we were trying to do was give an incentive for the districts to carry through and do a more systematic job of identifying the kids with problems and reaching them. But there's no question that already embedded in the school spending in the block grant at that point was a fair amount of resources devoted to just this effort. So trying to separate all those out from the basic teaching of reading, you really couldn't do. And they were already using, taking some of the kids out of the classroom and giving them special instruction. You already had the IEP for certain of the ones that had particularly developmental disabilities and other problems that had already been identified. So we were expanding on some of that. So it gets very difficult to identify the resources specifically. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So, at least one thing that I'm fairly certain that WDE can provide or staff can provide is I would like to know what our class size is, our actual class size average for K through 3. That should be information that's available.
Anyone else? Mr. Yes, go ahead.
Just a quick one, Matt, and I don't know if we do this or not. WD may be able to answer this too when they come up. Excuse me. Do we have any differentiation on the amount of money that Title I schools get? Because I know that some Title I schools get an influx for certain teaching positions and stuff like that. Do we get any of that information back from the school districts to show us what that, if there's a corollary maybe between the Title I influx of money towards reading and what their outcomes might be? I'm just kind of curious if we even have anything along those lines.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, are you asking, or is there a correlation between the amount of Title I funding a school district receives and their performance on statewide assessment?
Yeah, I think that's, Mr. Chairman, thank you, sir. I think that's probably the best way to put it, but I'm also kind of curious. I know they specifically get certain money for, reading interventionists, stuff like that in those particular areas. So I'm kind of curious if we can draw down to that. I don't know if we can get to that nitty gritty of a level or not.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, I'll have to defer the department to touch on that.
Anyone else? All right, thank you, Matt. WDE, you're up next. Morning, Shelly. Introduce yourself. Tell us who you represent, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Shelly Hamill with Wyoming Department of Education. I'm the Chief Academic Officer there, and I'm really grateful to be here this morning to talk about literacy with you. So I think have the benefit of following Mr. Wilmark this morning because I think he touched on many of the key points in the memo that we were requested to provide. So I think we'll move through that memo pretty quickly. He, the first page of the memo then starts with the background, which Matt has covered pretty thoroughly. But the reporting requirements for school districts to report annually to the WDE, the list is there on the bottom of page 1. So they need to provide annually to the Department of Ed progress at each grade level, kindergarten through grade 3. The statute then also says that the YTOP represents the progress for grade 3. So we have that. It also requires that they report the aggregate number of students that are identified by screening instruments as having signs of dyslexia or other reading difficulties by grade level. And then their reporting also needs to name the screening instrument that their district has chosen to use. It requires that they provide a list of evidence-based interventions used by their district at each grade level, a description of the specific training provided to reading teachers. And we know that they're often at those early grade levels, they're not just reading teachers. So what training have you provided to your elementary teachers or anyone else that's stepping into that arena? Description of the student-teacher ratio for reading instruction and intervention. So in the classroom and in as they move students through those interventions, what that teacher to student ratio is. And the description of the use of certified tutors, instructional facilitators, and paras in the K-3 setting that are trained in the delivery of evidence-based instruction and interventions programs. So those are what we look for as districts provide that reporting to us annually. We do collect that in October of each year. And in an effort to support districts to most efficiently provide that, we have provided a template to them that if they complete that template as their district literacy plan, we're able to see all of the components or all the required data elements. For districts that choose to use their own format, we have provided a checklist that includes all of the components so that they can double cross-reference that to make sure that they have included every component before they submit that report to us. So to support districts in progress towards meeting that goal of the 85% of students being proficient by the time that they end 3rd grade, the WD has done a couple of things, and that's what the rest of this memo is really touches on. So the first thing that we did as the legislative session ended in 2019 with those most recent changes to that statute was to choose to roll out a guidance document that provided support. And we were really grateful for the collaboration with YLIT and Heather Fleming and Carrie Roden for the development of that document. We rolled that out and we received a lot of feedback from educators across the state, really asking for more. They wanted a more expanded document, something that I think that they're really looking for extra support. Bless you. So for the last year, after it was out for about 3 to 4 months, we started receiving feedback. So we immediately went to work revamping that. And so what we did was we pulled together first a committee of national experts, and we used the Region 11 Comprehensive Center to organize that and work with them. And then when their work was finished, our work was finished with them, we then organized a group of educators across the state of Wyoming that were specifically identified and selected or invited to participate because of their extensive background in reading instruction and training. And so then they we had hoped that it would only be a few meetings, but they were so passionate about it and they've absolutely made our document better with their knowledge. So I really appreciate their work on that. And we released that formally just yesterday. It had been released across the state to educators about a month ago, but we did release a memo. In addition to the big 5 that the National Reading Panel's 2000 report identified as key components to teaching reading, and those 5, just in case you're not aware, phonemic awareness, phonics, reading fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary. Our Wyoming experts, those educators, they chose to add 2 more components to that in this most recent guidance document, and they included oral language and writing as part of the process to strengthen a child's literacy and reading skills. So that was that rolled out, of course, just within the past month and officially just yesterday. The other thing that, a couple of other things that the WD has been working towards and supporting districts in meeting that 85% goal, Matt touched on, and those two opportunities are the UW pilot program that I'll talk about, the comprehensive state literacy development grant that we applied for and received. And then, of course, I mentioned yesterday our focus on using some of those state reserve funds from ESSER 1 to support teacher training. So I'll start with, I'm going to skip the part of our memo that talks about the proficiency, because I think Matt covered that and you'll probably just have some questions. So the pilot program was identified in the 2020 session, and as the WD became aware of that, it was really, I think, targeted towards the University of Wyoming, but we felt like those offerings should be made available across the state to all districts. And so we partnered with them and created what we call the Embracing Literacy Conference. We brought in national experts from across the country that covered all of those main five, those big five topic areas in the development of literacy, and hosted that conference last year virtually in collaboration with the University of Wyoming. We had an amazing response to that. We had 559 participants across the state, and I think the ability to offer that, or the requirement to offer that virtually because of COVID, provided a far more opportunity for educators to participate. We also changed the format from being a block conference where you really were committed to these, 3 to 4 days, and we spread it out across the month of July. Because we had such great feedback, we continued that again this year. And today is the second to last day of the conference. It'll wrap up on Thursday. This year we have 471 individuals registered and attending, and we expanded. Last year's focus of the conference was on those big five and specifically teaching those in a virtual environment, as most of our teachers had shifted because of COVID. There was a big concern that they understand those core components and how might we be most effective in a virtual environment. This year, we've expanded that, and we have both national experts and Wyoming experts presenting. So we're excited about that. The next thing the last thing in the memo that I'll talk about is the Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grant. And we did receive that, and as Mr. Wilmot mentioned, it's a 5-year grant. It's renewable each year at the annual mark as we report our efforts to the federal government, and it could potentially bring $43.3 million into our state. We have rolled that out to districts, 95% of those funds. So the $8.6 million a year, 95% of that goes to districts. We were, I think, a little disappointed in the response rate to the application. We only had 8 districts respond, and we think that's reflective of the overwhelming experiences that our districts are having right now with so much federal funding, trying to figure out the best ways to use their ESSER funds, trying to manage the virtual environment or being back in a blended environment, as many parents have chosen to do that. Districts stood up those programs. And then, of course, the need to write this amidst the bandwidth being stretched. So we are currently working with additional districts that have data that would support that maybe they could benefit from this, or they might be interested in it. So we do have a team that's working with districts, trying to encourage and support them in submitting an application. So another thing that's happening with that is that the part of the grant application that we submitted to USED required a comprehensive state literacy plan. And we have a task force that is working with university representatives, community colleges, the library system across the state, educators, some business personnel, et cetera, to put together what we believe will be the framework that continues to guide literacy in our state. We know that there are a lot of different initiatives happening and wanting to really kind of pull those together and all of us be working towards the same target. So there's that going on. And I just want to point out, there were several questions yesterday about early childhood, and part of that CLSD, or the Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grant, is that 15% of the funds must be targeted at early childhood, 40% for K-6, and then 40% at the upper grade, that secondary, so 7-12. And with that, I will stand for any questions.
Co-chair Scott.
As I recall the debate on setting the 85% goal, it was that what we were debating was we were seeking to get kids reading at grade level. And I think that doesn't quite correspond to the various categories we use in the current assessment, Mr. Chairman. But it would seem to me that all the students that show as being below basic on the Y-top would probably fall into that category, not reading it at grade level. And I noticed that in the consultant's report on the recalibration, it reports student performance on the Y-top 2018, 2019, English language arts below grade level, below basic, and third grade 21.77%. That's different from what your table shows, and I don't know why it's different. They were reporting 21.77% below basic in third grade and 23.87% below basic in fourth grade. And I don't understand the difference between what they're reporting and what yours is, but it's both in the same range. And my sense is that that doesn't quite catch all the kids that really aren't satisfactorily reading at that grade level, but that's sure a good measure of it's at least that, and probably a little larger. My question to you is that a twofold? Is that a correct understanding that those kids are simply not performing well enough and should be the targets of this program? How many kids of school districts identify in this category as needing this kind of intervention and should be receiving it? What's the total number?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Scott. So I think in regards to the below basic, we reported 21.8 for third grade. And you said that they had reported 21.77. I think that's just a rounding difference. I don't have in front of me what we would report as fourth grade because I just pulled the third grade. So I can't really speak to that one. And I would suggest that we would be concerned about all students in the below basic and the basic categories as not being proficient or advanced. But as Senator Rothfuss pointed out, there's a lot of shifting targets. So how many students are really advanced or proficient? It's really difficult. So the Y-top is not necessarily we do use that as the measure at third grade because that's the one that is consistent across the state. We know that school districts are using far more data points to identify and determine which students need those interventions. So they screen and look for any student that might throw some red flags about they're not really getting this. And then they will take those students then into a diagnostic kind of arena and use diagnostic assessment to identify what are the specific areas that they need. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Discussion, because I think that was helpful. My question was, how many, what's the raw number of students that were identified and put into this effort to remediate? My guess is, from the data I've seen, that there are somewhere around 8,000 total third graders in the state. I presume I'm off a little bit one way or another. And if you're identifying 25% of those, that would be 2,000 students. How many are they identified?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, I will have to pull those numbers. They're reported as percentages, so I'll have to do some backtracking to pull those.
I'm asking is I do not think this performance is at all satisfactory. And I'm trying to figure out why it's not satisfactory, Chairman. And one of the things is if they simply are not identifying enough kids and identifying the right ones, that would be a major reason for the program not to be satisfactory in producing the results because you aren't creating enough. But I guess my further question is you're the overall manager for this thing. Why are we not getting better results?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, thanks for asking that question. I think we've touched upon that briefly in the discussion that's occurred so far. In preparation to apply for that comprehensive literacy state development grant, we ran a survey with our educators to understand what they felt like our needs were. And overwhelmingly, the highest concern that was expressed by our elementary teachers and special education teachers, administrators across the state was that teachers they didn't feel prepared. They were not prepared to teach literacy. I reflect on my own educational preparation program as a special education teacher, and I was not prepared to step in and teach a child that didn't know how to learn to read or that wasn't progressing. I wasn't prepared. I didn't have an understanding of what those components were. How does a typical individual learn to read? And then when something's not working right for a child, how do I identify what that is? And then what do I do about it? And so we've heard that overwhelmingly. I think that the feedback that we received from educators across the state in regards to our guidance document confirms that we need more. The high numbers of attendance in the comprehensive or the Embracing Literacy conference, where we're teaching fundamentals. I think that indicates that we're working with a group of people that really want to move their students. They want their students to read, but they don't know what to do necessarily. And I think that Chairman Paxton mentioned the reports from his daughters that we work with whatever curriculum we have in the classroom, and the school districts across our state have a variety of curricula that they've selected. There's no one perfect program. There is no program that has all of the components perfectly balanced with the right pacing guide, with the with the instruction to help teachers know how to do that, which is one of the reasons why we rolled out the letters training for educators across our state. It doesn't attempt to replace the curriculum that a school district has, but instead it tries to backfill that gap and provide educators in our state an understanding of how does a child learn to read? Why are they having difficulty? How do I identify specifically what they might need? And it's difficult because it's a huge time commitment for teachers. They're probably looking at a 10 to 12 hour a month commitment on top of their regular teaching responsibilities and their responsibilities to their families. But we're really excited that we have over 300 teachers signed up to participate in that. And they're already in the field teaching, but we still need to focus on those teachers that are in prep programs. And I mentioned that survey. I know there are a lot of questions. I mentioned that survey that we rolled out, and we did ask teachers where they had received their preparation, whether it was in-state or out-of-state, and it was consistent across the board that if they were prepared to teach out-of-state and then came to our state for employment, they also did not feel prepared. So I think that's consistent across the board.
And we got quite a few questions here. Representative Nyman, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you kind of answered maybe a little bit of the question I had. As I've listened to the discussion and kind of tried to wrap my mind around kind of some of the nuances and the problems that we're facing in education, consistently it seems like as if teachers are leaving college. I mean, maybe I'm wrong here, but ill prepared, because we're talking a lot about programs after teachers are already in the field working and have kids in the classroom that they're responsible for. So now we're going to develop training in order to help those educators to do a better job and to be more proficient and getting the point across to these kids and helping them. So my question would be, in your opinion, if you were king or queen for the day, what would you prefer to see? Because are we missing something in our higher education levels that our teachers, our elementary education or educators are coming out not ready? What would you suggest that would be done so that these teachers are not having to play, and something I hate to play is catch up ball. You know, why are we having teachers leaving colleges that are not ready to meet the obviously known demands of education and in special education and even reading? What would you do differently? And do we have a problem that needs to be addressed at the higher education level so that these folks are ready to meet these challenges instead of having to try to be trained in the field? It would be more efficient, in my opinion, of it.
Representative Neiman, I think that it's important to note that that response is probably best to come from someone representing higher education in our state. I can only report what educators share with us and my own experiences, but I do think that we're always in a cycle of wanting to get better. So we would want to be offering those professional developments and such, but I think that there is an obvious concern about when we hear overwhelmingly from teachers and we see the response. It's one of the highest attended conferences that we've ever offered. And again, this year we're seeing those same numbers. We are hearing from educators that have participated in those last year's conference, and this year we recorded every one of those sessions, and they're available to them to go back and listen to on the Canvas learning management system. We are aware that there are administrators across the state that are having teachers use those in their PLCs to start utilizing that resource in a way that teaches maybe the things that they either didn't get enough of or haven't truly been exposed to. So but outside of that, I can't really speak to that. I think that's probably the university's role.
Sen Scott, I think you were next. Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just a few things. One, just some anecdotal stuff on reading. My sister taught reading for 25 years and she got her master's at the University of Wisconsin. And so at that time they did, they were doing direct instructions, the process called direct instruction. And then that went away and some other fad came in. And then probably reading dropped off a little bit. I think the ability to teach reading. And I think now some of that's coming back a little bit more, the idea of phonics and that sort of thing. So, I think some of what we're seeing is you see these changes, whether it's math or English or, reading, whatever, you see these changes in philosophies on how to teach, and some of them are successful and some of them are not successful over time. One question I have is on the screenings. We talked a little bit earlier about, you want to have the same measure, right? And so is our screenings or our assessments to students in K through 3 to determine their level of reading competency, is that pretty uniform throughout the state, or or are there a whole bunch of varied assessments, and are they similar? Do we know if they're similar? Do we know if we are identifying this if the child being identified in Pinedale is the same child being identified in Laramie. So tell me a little bit about that piece, please.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Summers. I think we're all aware that screening instruments are different than reading assessments. You kind of mentioned both, which are also different than a progress monitoring tool. But I can tell you, I pulled just the names of the reading assessments that school districts reported using K2, and there were 17 different tools used. So in theory, if they're valid and reliable, all 17 of them, then they should be yielding good information, but it would certainly make it easier, I guess, for all of us to understand that are not statisticians or, you know, really reading experts, if there was more commonality among those tools. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just, and so on the screening tools, which are different than the assessments. So those early, you know, those really early screening tools, are they very similar as well? Or are there a wide variety of those?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Summers, they're equally diverse.
Representative Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a real quick comment first and then a question. I think all of us, and I think whether you graduate in college with an ag degree or an engineering degree or a teaching degree, you find out, you don't know what you don't even know your first year on the job. I mean, I wouldn't wish first year teaching on my worst enemy. I mean, it's just brutal. And so I think that's part of that. I just think, but I guess as we keep going through this, and I go back to Matt Wilmar's presentation on page 4, and in recalibration, we had a nice presentation on NAEP scores, really in depth for the committee, and went through it. And basically, we're one of the best in the country, 4th grade reading, and one of the best in the world, actually. Does the whole country can't read then, or what? I mean, I keep hearing problems and all this stuff, but we're one of the best in the country. And so again, and then I look back to this table 1 in 17-18 where we changed the measure. The best way to measure change is not change the measure, but then you go through even the pause where the cut scores are constantly changed. I served on all those committees for the last 20 years. And it's frustrating for us because then the statute says 85% at grade level. And then the co-chairman says, well, that should be proficient. Well, then maybe you say it's not. So I think we're looking to find out what's real. Now, I'm married to a 35-year first grade teacher. I know what's real, and I think a lot of it's readiness. Geez, I read to my kids when they're still inside their mom, right? Read to them every night. There's a lot of kids don't get read to. There's a lot of groups out there trying to get books in the homes. Readiness is a part of this, but then I think the co-chairman said too, this whole thing, the standard stuff works for probably half the kids, but it's that other 50%. And I think for all of us, we don't get caught up in all this number. We're one of the best in the country. And the thing with education, it's like everything is continuous improvement. So my question really is the whole country can't read? Is that the issue? I mean, the whole United States can't read, but we're the top best of the worst. Is that what's going on?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Harshman, I guess simply put, yes. We definitely see other states that are struggling where we are, as you pointed out, score really high on the NAEP consistently. We hear there's a lot of talk about Mississippi or Tennessee, or you hear a lot of conversation around several different states whose scores might have been much lower than ours. And so you're seeing a lot of growth in those states, but their overall scores may still be lower than ours. And what we find when we go looking to say, well, what's happening is they're pulling together practices, and they're teaching, they're preparing their teachers, they're working with their teachers that are already in service not just those that are pre-service and in preparation. And they're working to build the knowledge base and the skill set that they need to be effective educators in the classroom when it comes to literacy. And then I just wanted to touch on the readiness factor just a little bit. I think when we talk about kindergarten readiness, there's certainly a component of that that leads to a child's ability to be ready to start learning how to read. But it's greater than just those components about literacy, their ability to attend, their ability to follow directions, so many different components. So, that could be a discussion in and of itself, I think.
Mr. Co-Chair, I think our thing is, I guess I don't think the entire United States is horrible or we're one of the best in the world. I guess when we heard that report and recal, it was the presentation from your department. He actually said, this is a real report to celebrate. I remember those words, we should be celebrating this. And so I just want to make sure I'm kind of hearing this right, because I'm hearing the word problems, troubles, all that. But this whole deal is about continuous improvement. I mean, we're going to get better and better. That's what this is all about. But I think part of this too, I think, gosh, we're not horrible. We're kicking butt on most of the United States. And I think we want to continue to, but I don't think that NAEP is ever going to be at 85%. That's just not. And so I think we got to all understand what these measures mean. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Looks like we have all kinds of hands down there, but just a comment about that last statement. My daughter, the kindergarten teacher, had 2 kids last year that weren't even potty trained coming into kindergarten. So those are the kind of challenges that the kindergarten teachers face, and we can't ignore that too. And I think we'll go down. I think Representative Conley, maybe you had your hand up. Is that right?
Thank you, Mr.
I
Chairman.
can't see you very well down there. Go ahead.
Thank you. And I have 3 different questions, and I want to just follow up on Representative Harshman and talking about our scores, and that our scores are good. They're great. But the reality is we have been committed to this topic to do our number one, best by our kids, but also because we were concerned at one point about the expense that we have for special ed. And once kids get on IEPs, and our 100% reimbursement means that we spend a lot of money, and we'd like to not spend that much money if we don't have to. Let's just put it that way. And one of the ways was that we identify kids earlier before they are on IEPs and get them ready as well as proficient by 3rd grade. So my first question, Ms. Hamill, is do you have any kind of data that illustrates those kinds of points?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Connolly, I don't necessarily know that we have any data. I would have to go looking to see if we could draw some kind of a comparison between the early intervention and the ability to defer a child or not need to step into special education. Of course, we understand that IDEA requires that anytime there's suspected disability that we don't postpone, that we move forward with an assessment. But I think you're absolutely correct in the ability to intervene early and understand what a child's needs are specifically and provide them what they need, so that, and that would be, I think we can all agree that that would be the best thing to do. Identify early, correct that problem before it becomes a larger problem. It's better in so many ways, more than just the financial component, a child's self-esteem, their life, their whole everything. So I don't know that we have any data that draws that direct correlation.
And Ms. Hamill, there's nothing that I said that any evidence would contradict. That it makes sense that the more we do earlier, the better. So my next question, and it's honestly a concern when you talked about, first, congratulations to the department for getting that grant, but that only 8 districts have applied for it. And could you give us some more information about that? Who are the 8 districts? Do they already have programs in place and that they saw the money as an ability to bolster it? Or were they more districts that had nothing in place and saw it as an opportunity to finally do something? So I am curious about that as we go forward, thinking about how we can do better.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly. So the 8 districts across the state that did apply and were awarded the grant, they're scattered across the state. I know we have one from Uinta. I'm sorry, I didn't bring my computer up and I should have printed that data out, printed those lists. All of our districts have programs in place already, but at least these 8 saw the opportunity to say, we really want to do better. While we are doing great by our students and it's demonstrated by NAEP scores, we still want to do better. We want to do better by all of our students and the ones that are struggling as well. And so they saw that as an opportunity, I think, to make some significant change. I mean, that funding is there that can even replace maybe a curriculum that they believe is not as effective as they would like, even though there is no perfect one. Putting those pieces together, creating a district literacy plan. So there was a disappointment on our part about only 8, but like I said, we are working with additional districts. We funded all 8, but we did work with some districts that maybe didn't have a plan that we felt was as robust as it needed to be to meet the requirements of the grant. And so we worked with them to support that, and really excited about the work that'll be happening for those 8 and anticipating that will spread to more districts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Hamill, I might want to visit with you more about that because it sounds like it's districts that already had programs in place and saw it as an opportunity to bolster. Yeah, and so we're not getting to the districts that have nothing in place at this point or nothing significant in place. So let me ask you my third question, and this is about the need for a comprehensive literacy plan. And this would be one of my oh boy howdies as somebody who had been involved in that kind of initiative years ago. And it's really difficult, at least certainly, and my experience was it was really difficult to get all of the players at the table. And you honestly had, at that point, and we're talking maybe a decade ago, individuals that did not believe that kindergarten readiness or early literacy was important. That instead it should be something that is in the home and how kids show up in kindergarten, whether or not, and I hate to say it, whether or not they're potty trained is now up to the school district to take care of. And so I am curious about your what you're calling the comprehensive literacy plan. How is it going? And you just gave us a very high level, we're going to get this done. But somebody with some experience here has said this is not so easy.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Connolly. So so far, the committee, I think, is like-minded in recognizing that our efforts need to target all the way from our earliest little learners to those adults that are not literate yet. So it's the full spectrum. We have people on the committee that are like-minded and recognize the needs at all of those different levels. We are at a stage where we've been reviewing other states' comprehensive literacy plans, their statewide plans, and looking at what components we think are valuable and that we like and what might be missing as we look to craft what ours will be for Wyoming.
Last follow-up, what's the timetable for the completion of that plan?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure that we have a timeline, just like with the guidance document. I think that it's a dynamic process. We would hope to have something ready to release by next spring, but that we recognize that it's likely an ongoing, evolving process.
I think Representative Obermuller was next, and then I think Senator Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to take it back to a pretty basic level here for my own understanding. Being a little bit more old school relating to grades and percentages, a little bit more than terms. Can you define for me what proficient means and maybe relate it somehow to testing, percentages, grades? What does a proficient student look like? Thank you. And I have a follow-up after that, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Obermuller, I guess in the most simplest terms, we would say that a child that is proficient is performing where we believe they should be performing.
And how do you determine that? Is that a percentage on a test, a percentage of right answers, or how do you determine that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, at this point, yeah, it's a percentage. It's a percentage on the YTOP test.
Mr. Chairman, what is that percentage?
Mr. Chairman, I am not sure what each percent, what the proficient mark is for each of the separate tests in our YTOP. I would have to pull that. I apologize that I just don't hold numbers really well.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, one more thing. Is there any, when you look at figure 2 of this on page 5, and you look at these percentages, just curious if there's ever any parsing of these numbers that identifies a little bit more narrowly the groups you're looking at. When you look at the 30%, and you go through that, if you have a group of 10 kids and they're in my classroom and 2 of them are special needs kids, 4 of them, and 4 of that 10 are proficient, I've got a 40% proficiency in my classroom. But the 2 special needs kids will never potentially be able to read if they're included in this. If they're not included, now it's 50%. So I'm just curious if there's ever any parsing of these numbers to say, hey, when you look at it on a bell curve or some other basis where we're narrowing the scope of who we're looking at, how these percentages change.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, so the data for the YTOP is disaggregated by student subgroup. So you'll be able to kind of take a look at how each of the subgroups are performing. And we certainly recognize that there are additional challenges for some student subgroups, but we believe that all students should be performing well. And so we continue to work towards that, whether a child's on an IEP or not. So.
Thank you. I'm not sure I understand that answer, but thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Senator Ruffus and then Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hamill, one of the things that you mentioned briefly was the fact that there was some discussion about differences between screeners and more summative assessments and performance-based metrics. I'm not sure that we have delved into that enough. I'd appreciate a little more discussion about how the statutes are structured with regard to reading intervention, whether you're proficient or not, effectively, right? If you have reading difficulties and you're advanced, it's my understanding that statute would still require an appropriate intervention. You don't necessarily have to follow the 2 standard deviations for a severe discrepancy model. And I think it's important to have that discussion and to realize that the statutes are not just trying to bring people up to proficient, that it's a recognition that those reading difficulties may occur even if you're an advanced performer and you have other challenges. So can you provide a little bit more context of what's being done to address those individuals that might be showing up as proficient, but still may be tested and still may receive help and support, even if they've tested proficient throughout their educational career?
Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, that's a good point. I think that as at least my experience and what I hear from educators in the fields currently is that I don't think they're looking necessarily at only one data point, like I mentioned before. So they're not looking through the list of YTOP scores in isolation and saying, well, these students tested proficient or advanced, so we don't need to screen them. The requirement is that all students are screened. And so any child, regardless of whether performance would be on the YTOP, would be screened.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the difference between a screener and a competency-based assessment looks like and how it's used if you're dealing with a class of 2nd graders or something along those lines? What does a screener look like versus what we expect out of a YTOP test?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, so simply a screener would be a tool that maybe takes 5 to 7 minutes, maybe 10 max to administer to a child. And it's just going to identify there might be something amiss. And those are quick. They're quick. You just want to collect anyone that you think might have a challenge. Then the next step then would be, once that group of students are identified, that we need to really go a little bit further to find out, is there really a problem? Or, we would assume that the screener is valid and reliable. So is there a problem? To what extent would it be? And so then we would step into maybe something that's more diagnostic, to identify why the screener popped that way, and look to see, does the child have a difficulty with decoding? Does the child have difficulty with phonemic awareness? Is it a vocabulary problem? They just don't have enough oral language to understand, or is it a comprehension challenge? Because it, like you pointed out, it could be an older student as well, in second or third grade.
Mr. Ellis, and then the Representative Newsom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make a comment because it's come up a few times. We've had, I know, representative from the University of Wyoming, including President Seidel, at our hearing this morning. We heard this concern a couple of years ago when we talked about the screening tool and what would be appropriate and how we can start doing a better job of identifying kids that have dyslexia and other reading challenges. And I just wanted to comment that, at the time I reached out to the university to see what was being taught at the the School of Education. Since that time, there's been obviously a new president, a new dean of the College of Ed. The University of Wyoming has a literacy center, and I believe there's a new director of that. All of these individuals are new on the job, so I just want you to know I appreciate you being here, because I think you're understanding what we're grappling with. But also wanted to thank the university. I expressed concern about what was being taught and was invited to visit with some of the candidates for those positions. So at some point, I do think it'd be appropriate if the university wanted to make a comment on that point. But if not, I understand that too. But I just really want you to know I thank you for being here, because we're trying to get to the heart of it. And I think a lot has changed since that was 2 years ago when we first worked on that bill.
Senator, thank you. And my intention was to call the university folks up just after the break and let them have an opportunity to respond to some of these. Representative Newsom, I believe you're next.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I had a question about any offerings of parental support when a child is not performing. And is there a standardized or materials that are sent home with the child, or is there more contact with the parents in the situation than a traditional parent-teacher conference that kind of nobody shows up for? What is the school's support of the family as we're grappling with these literacy issues? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Newsom, thanks for the question. Absolutely, all school districts, I think, have strong efforts at family engagement and support. As we, just like all educators want their students to be successful in the classroom, we know parents want their children to be successful. So there are a lot of efforts, there are a lot of materials that go home. I wanted to draw out a comment off of something that Representative Connolly mentioned in questioning about the CLSD grant, that and I just wanted to point out that all districts have a literacy program. Some may have stronger components that represent the 5 plus the oral language and the writing component. Maybe some are stronger than others, but all districts would also have efforts that work to engage those families in drilling down. I know with dyslexia, it's important to understand the family history, because there could be a family history of reading difficulty, and that just helps educators understand the child and maybe what their next steps are, along with the more formal diagnostic measures.
Anyone else? Other questions?
Mr. Chairman, just one last.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to kind of go back to the screenings and assessment piece and the fact that we have this wide variation. Two things, actually, one on that and one other thing that I want to mention. So, what's the solution to that? Is it that you pick from 17? Is it you pick from 2? Do we require consistency in our screenings? Is there a logical solution to that? And is that under your authority in your rules and regulations to do that, or would we have to do that statutorily?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, at this point, that is not within our statutory authority to identify the screening or assessment tools outside of the YTOP at third grade. So that would certainly be something that this committee or the legislative body as a whole may want to tackle. I do want to say that no matter what the screening instrument is or the assessments, it's really critical that they be implemented with fidelity. So even if we selected one, or we were charged with identifying a list of 3 or something along those lines, that it would be important that all districts receive the appropriate training that they needed to be able to implement those with fidelity, so that we could rest assured that the results were consistent.
Follow up? And Mr. Chairman, thank you. So, what, I assume that you have some of that, right? I mean, that is professional development in a way. I don't know if it's professional development you do, or if it's professional development that districts do. It sounds like in this grant piece, maybe that you have some money for some of that. So I'm a little interested in that. And then, I want to get quickly back on the early childhood piece, because something I would really like to see with some of the largesse of federal money is to try to create an endowment that would kick off a little money to these early childhood programs. And so how important, I'm asking you like a softball, but how important is early childhood education to this whole literacy piece?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, I don't think that we could, I don't think I could overemphasize the critical importance of those early years. It's just essential that our little children are exposed to pre-academic, those readiness opportunities where they're experiencing the language development, et cetera. We can't pick up children at kindergarten and expect to be able to have them be proficient readers by third grade if the building blocks are not there already. We receive them, teachers receive them, just like Chairman Paxton mentioned, wherever they are. These kindergarten teachers take them wherever they are, and the first grade teacher receives them wherever they are. And they all do their very best at using the skill set that they have to move them forward. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't look at the system as a whole. Further, I'd like to add that with the letters training that we're offering, the CLSD grants, while we've paid for the opportunity for educators, K-12 educators, to participate in letters with the ESSER funds, we're using a portion of the state reserve funds with the CLSD grant to provide that letters training for early childhood providers. We'd like to make that available to home daycare providers as well, because they spend a lot of hours with young children, so that they understand. It's a shorter, more condensed course, but we think one that would be of great value. So right now we have about 100 people signed up for that. We're hoping to see that climb.
Co-Chair Scott?
Mr. Chairman. The assessment question. As I remember, the Arkansas district that this was modeled on, I wish I could even remember which district it was, but they were using a very primitive assessment technique, very, very simple, and relying in good part on the recommendations from the teachers, because the competent teacher will know, even if she doesn't have the time or the particular training skills to identify, fix the problem that a particular kid has. She knows the kid has a problem. And they were identifying kids that way. Have we made the process of identifying assessment to identify the kids that need the help? Have we made it too complicated and bureaucratic to be effective?
Chairman, Senator Scott, I don't believe so. I think that there are a lot of effective screening tools out there. There are a lot of effective diagnostic tools. and progress monitoring options. We've offered funding for Fast Bridge for our districts across the state, and we do have a lot of districts that opted on for that. There are, if we're talking only literacy, there are lots of tools that districts can choose to purchase that would help with the screening, the progress monitoring, et cetera, that are easy and timely for teachers to implement. And I just want to point out that we're talking a lot about testing, and sometimes assessment testing gets a bad rap, but it's part of that formative assessment that teachers are doing in the classroom all the time. Good teachers do that all the time because they want to know what are the next steps, where's the gap for this student. And so that, you know, I want to just be careful that we understand that that's part of good teaching.
The identification and in the treatment, once you've identified a kid, does the school psychologist play any significant role?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott. So that would be more at the level where there's a suspected disability. But I mean, we might have a teacher that's doing some diagnostics that are continually monitoring their children as they should be. And they might recognize that a child's having a hard time with just the vowel consonant vowel or silent E, you know, vowel consonant silent E at the end, and they don't understand that that causes that previous vowel to elongate or and so the long vowel sound. And so they might just need to pull that child for a short-term intervention, you know, and teach them that skill. And then they go back into the tier 1 all class instruction. So when we talk about screening and diagnostics, it's not necessarily always fast tracking a student to or tracking a student to special education, because like I said, a child that is in need of special education services should be assessed early. If these interventions aren't working and a child still has problems, we need to go down that path. But often for a lot of kids, it might just be that maybe they were absent or they didn't feel really good that day when the teacher was initially instructing in that, and they weren't as focused as they maybe needed to be to walk away with that skill. So it's lots of opportunities to teach that skill, and sometimes just quick intervention and then back out. So the school psych would not be involved at that level.
Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
Mr. Chairman, following up on Representative Summers' question about whether there's statutory authority, my understanding was a little bit different, that the legislation, both from 2012 and from 20, whenever we did that, included the ability through rule and regulation to specify screeners or testing, which would allow for the authority of what Representative Summers was asking about, but that it was intentionally not prescribed because of the multitude of different purposes for the screeners and a desire by the districts to have flexibility in that space to make determinations of which screeners were appropriate in which circumstances, and that was the result of a couple of task forces that assembled to kind of contemplate, should we have rules and regulations and should we specify which screeners. So the product that ended up on the website, as I understood it, that's linked to is a discussion of these are screeners and tests that we find to be useful and appropriate, and that was the extent of what the departments elected to do, but they could have gone further. And am I misunderstanding that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I hate to sit here at this table and have to say, I'm going to have to go back and look at that, because my understanding was that responsibility for districts to have that. And so maybe we're both saying, maybe we're in the same spot, but I'm just seeing it a little differently, that I believe that responsibility was given back to the districts, but maybe we would have the ability to identify a list from which they could choose without a statutory change.
And Mr. Chairman, that could have changed in the most recent bill and been different than the previous one. And maybe that's the case. I guess I'd look to staff to see if they can clarify that.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, you're correct. 21.3.401D provides the department with authority to promulgate rules and regulations as necessary to assist each school district to administer its reading assessment and intervention programs pursuant to this section.
Anyone else? We've got public comment coming up, so that'll probably take a while. Anyone else? Yeah, we're gonna do that after the break. Okay, with that, we'll open it up to public comment.
Mr.
Maybe
Chairman?
Shelley, if you would. Oh,
Mr.
we did
Chairman, I'm
have
just
one more.
curious, before we go to public comment, if the university could come up and we could ask them some
Well,
questions about
my
this.
intention was to have them afterwards so we could have some continuity, but Shelley, if you wouldn't mind staying up there, we might have some comments from the public that may want to engage you at the same time, if you don't mind. So with that, we'll open it up to public comment. Anyone in the audience here that would like to comment? Doesn't look like it. We do have someone. Okay, I can't see around the screen. Please introduce yourself and tell us who you represent.
My name is Gay Wilson, and I am a retired Laramie County School District teacher. I just retired this year after teaching for 21 years. This is my first time testifying before a committee, so I'll apologize in advance if I get a little too nervous and can't think on my feet. My reading career consisted of teaching 6th grade for 5 years in a Title I school. I was then trained to work as a Title I reading intervention teacher. I didn't know what I was doing, so I took the Linda Mood Bell training that was offered at that time and used that when I was a Title I reading teacher. I also then went back to the classroom in 2nd grade and taught for 6 years, so I could see what was going on in the regular classroom again because I didn't want to lose touch with that. The last 3 years of my career, I was offered a reading interventionist position. And so I took the letters training and used that with what I knew already as a reading interventionist and taught at-risk students in another Title I school. What I kind of wanted to share today with you is my thoughts on what I've experienced as a reading teacher over the years and what I've seen with students in the classroom. When I first started in the school district, a program called CLIP was being used. CLIP is a whole language program, and it was used for up until just the last few years as a reading intervention program in our school district. When I started doing the Linda Mood Bell training and working with students in small groups, we noticed a pattern of a lot of children who had been in a whole language program or that whole language program that we were seeing again and again that needed reading intervention. And so we couldn't figure out why that was. We kept using.
It was okay if I interrupt. I would love to know what whole language is, just so I understand what you're saying about that. so we kinda know what
Certainly.
that means.
Whole language is where a child is basically taught to guess at a word. So they read a text, and based on the context of the text and the words around it, they were supposed to guess what maybe the word was that they didn't know. So they didn't learn how to decode a word and figure out what the sounds and letters were. That was used somewhat, but as a reading intervention, they were using the whole language method of teaching them how to guess at words. We now know with the science of reading that that is not how children learn how best to read. They learn best with the code system. We're a speech to print brain. And so we know that that's doing a whole language approach is not correct. So, and this is all in my opinion and my experience, we've had 20 years of students at least going through our district. I don't know if that program was used statewide or not, but we have 20 years of kids who've gone through our school system that weren't taught the correct way to read. You're always going to have the students that are going to read no matter what instruction you give to them. Their brain just processes the information like it's supposed to. But at-risk students need specific, systematic instruction in learning how to read. And we now know that. And so I am very grateful that we finally got some legislation passed that addresses dyslexic students and students that are at risk, so that they can get the help that they need. I've seen one too many children sit in reading groups and cry and get tears in their eyes because they know they can't read. And just this last year, I had an 8-year-old boy who was reading at a kindergarten reading level, and he knew it. And he would sit there and cry in group every day because he didn't know how to read. And so as someone who, and all teachers care about their students, but what we're lacking is the training for teachers. They don't know how to teach reading. Some teachers do, and I'm grateful that we're now offering classes and courses where teachers can learn the appropriate way to teach students to read. We need to, instead of offering reading instruction, we need to start requiring it. Anyone who teaches an elementary child has to have training in how kids learn to read. Everything we do is based on how we read, no matter what subject it is. And some teachers may go, oh, I'm only going to teach in, 5th or 6th grade, so I don't need to know how to teach kids how to read. But they do. When I first started teaching 6th grade, I had students who could read like a house of fire but couldn't comprehend. I had no clue how to help them. And there were students who read at a pre-kindergarten level in 6th grade. I didn't know how to teach them how to decode either. And it wasn't until I became trained in a specific program that was sequential and followed a specific steps that I learned why and how students learn to read. And I took the letters training 3 years ago and learned even more. Just when you think you can't learn more, you can. Because now they have brain imaging to show how children learn to read. It's no longer top down versus bottom up, which is the whole language is top down. Kids learn to guess at words. Bottom up is where they learn to decode words. So now with the brain imaging, we have proof that children learn to read from a bottom up method. And so I realize that there's different philosophies out there, but really it's come down to one specific philosophy. And I feel like the state of Wyoming is now getting on the right track. And I'm very grateful to them because I've watched this go on for too long. So I thank the State Department of Ed and the board and the legislature for helping the state to get going in the right direction with helping children learn to read. I sat before I came because I wanted to figure out what is it, because I've heard several of you ask, why is it that we're having problems with kids reading? Why do we not have more proficient? And I do think that we are seeing the end of all of those students who were at risk that did not get taught properly. And so they're going to struggle for a long time. And they did not get the amount of intervention that they needed. One of the things I learned the most about being a teacher of reading is that it takes time. When you have a student in 5th or 6th grade and they're 2 to 3 years behind, you're not going to fix them in a day. You're not going to fix them in a week. You probably are not even going to fix them in a year. It takes time. Currently, as a reading interventionist, I was given 30 minutes a day to work with students who are already getting behind. And I told my principal, I cannot fix them in 30 minutes a day. I need more. Part of our challenges as reading interventionists is trying to get enough time in the day. So one of the things we need to figure out is, how do we do that? I keep hearing more and more and more being added to teachers' plates. And as a classroom teacher, I can speak to that. I was addressing 9 to 10 different subjects during the day. And how do I meet all of the state standards and still try to get the students in my care the instruction they need to be able to read? So it gets to be very difficult. What do you cut out? What do you not cut out? I heard the comments about, the foreign language from Senator Ellis. And I had the privilege of actually teaching her children, who I dearly loved. And it is important to have language. I also know that before age 8, Chairman Scott had you mentioned that it is the best time to teach children a foreign language. Here's my challenge with that. When you have children that can't even read English, why are we going to be trying to teach them a different language? Does it help them to read? Sure. But when they're already struggling, do those children need to be getting that instruction? Some of the other things that I would like to address. So my number one is to help teachers get that reading instruction. I feel like when they go through the university, at least I know I did, I was not prepared how to teach kids to read. I took one class, not one course, but I had one class where I learned how to teach kids to read. It was a video is about what it was. I feel like it would be really good if our university could start implementing several courses in teaching kids to read, and I know they're working in that direction. Some of the other things that I would like to address is also when we did at our school back 13 years ago, I was part of an RTI team, which was response to intervention. Now they call it MTSS, which is basically the same thing. And one thing I'm happy with is that now this year in our school district, at least, they're implementing a screener. We talked about that, called FastBridge. 13 years ago when I was on it was a state RTI pilot school. And we started the same process that we're doing now with the MTSS. And it never went anywhere. So I'm hoping that this continues forward. We had the screener where we could screen almost 500 students in 2 days. And it gave us a good idea of where they were at and which kids we needed to target for further reading intervention assessments. Excuse me, my mouth is so dry. Yeah, my water's back there. Sorry about that. It helped us to target what students we needed to give further assessments to and give instruction to. We need to have districts all on board with that. We need to have the state on board with that, so that everybody in every district is doing that. The other thing that we need to have is consistent testing across the state. Right now, every district gets to decide what they want their assessments to look like. It's hard to compare oranges to oranges when everybody's doing something different. We have our assessments that we look at the end of 3rd grade, but what are we using to look at kids in kindergarten through 2nd grade? We need a consistent assessment across the state to be able to determine that so that kids can move from school to school or state to state. We also need to work on those tiered interventions. Students do need the tier 1 in the classroom, which is where the teacher training comes in. But we also need teachers trained in tier 2 and tier 3 interventions for students so we can move them in and out. You had mentioned how you might have a student who might not know certain skills. So they need to be put in a level 2 tier intervention, learn those skills quickly and get them out. Then we need to have more teachers in a level tier 3 intervention. In our school district, we have, fortunately for us, 18, and maybe next year we have a few more reading interventionists who work with at-risk students. The problem is we don't have even enough of those. One of the schools I taught with, they don't even get a reading interventionist, yet they have students who would qualify for one. And so we need to make sure that even though we have the legislation to address that, it should be required that any student who meets that criteria, that they receive intervention services from a trained interventionist. The school that I worked in now has teachers that have not been trained in an intervention program. They're working with the students after school, before school, doing the best that they know how. And so those students are not getting an equitable at-risk intervention. And so there's another reason why we probably see students not moving forward, because they're not getting the instruction that they need. And so we need to make sure that if students qualify, that it's required by the district to make sure they are getting someone that has been trained in an intervention. One of the things that I see too is there are title teachers that are not being trained in any reading intervention. Title teachers are being allowed to work with at-risk students who have zero training. And that's another thing that I feel like needs to stop, because we should have our best and brightest and best trained teachers working with those at-risk students. And so I think we need to relook at, and I don't know whether it's done at a district level, I believe, how title schools are being used and how their funds are being used. And if students are at risk, those teachers need to be used at that level. Instead of doing, I've seen it where title teachers sit and just watch children work on a computer program. That shouldn't happen. They should be working directly with students, not watching them work on a computer program. I've seen title teachers who are doing what, just carrying on the lesson that the classroom teacher had. Title teachers, I feel, should be working specifically with students who are at risk, not just making sure each classroom teacher gets a title time and do whatever the teacher wants them to do. So I think there needs to be tighter guidelines on how that looks. With regard to special ed, I think there also needs to be, I have seen where there is not a lot of accountability with our special ed departments sometimes, where students are being taught with fidelity and being taught again by teachers who are not trained in specific programs. They're just kind of picking and choosing what they want to teach. And I think part of the problem is sometimes is that they don't have the materials. Same with the title. They don't have the materials that they need. So we have thousands. I can tell you, I took thousands and thousands of books at the end of the school year. And we tried to give them away. We had daycares come and take some because they were whole language books that were used for CLIP intervention. At-risk kids cannot learn from those materials. So part of the challenge comes in finding the funding for getting all the schools the materials that they need in order to teach kids the correct way. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed, maybe by the legislature, of trying to get schools funding for those materials. I guess I would just say that I would like to see the training better implemented and give teachers the confidence that they need to help our children learn to read successfully. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Yes. Your office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I do have one question regarding the discussion about whole language versus phonics. And I think you've passionately moved from someone who was whole language originally trained into phonics. The concern I have is a concern that I would have with honestly either camp, which is when we have discussions, it almost seems like it's a battle of purists of whole language is always right. No, phonics is always right. But one of the things that you said early on is that students are different. And my question, which again, this debate's gone on for 30 years plus, and there's still hundreds of articles published every year in the battle of whole language versus phonics. Why are we assuming one of them is always right and that students don't learn differently?
Mr. Chairman and committee members, there has always been that battle, and students do learn differently, I would agree, but we now know how the reading brain works, and I am by far not an expert on it. And of course, I just took the training in the last few years. So I know there's a lady after me that will speak that will answer that far better for you than I can. All I know is now that we have the brain imaging, it has proven through instruction that they have used and re-imaged the brain that it lights up the reading paths that children need to learn how to read. And even the whole language guru, Lucy Calkins, she is now changing her position on whole language. and realizing that students learn best from a code-based instruction. So I think you're going to see the pendulum is starting to swing. You know, it's been swinging back and forth for years and years and years. In 21 years, I've seen it swing all the time. But I think now we're going to change that pendulum to a compass where the arrow is pointing in the right direction of how students need to learn how to read. And you keep talking about why are we not seeing better success? So until we can all get on the same page about how students learn to read and what's best instruction for them, then I think we'll start seeing that change. When I worked at the title school where I worked at, and we had a super program put together that we used for 8 years. And it was using a program at that time called Linda Bell. And we were able to give students 60 minutes of instruction every day. We also used the RTI process. So we had children in different tiered interventions, moved them in and out, depending on their need. And we were so successful at it that we were able to get rid of a half-time special ed position. So it can be done, but it has to be done systematically. Everybody has to be on the same page, and it has to be done with fidelity.
Well, I guess the concern that I have, and to be clear, and the woman who is going to follow you and I have been talking about this for years, and I've been a supporter of all this legislation and a sponsor of most of the bills we're talking about. But I'm always concerned when we decide that there's one right answer. And so again, I don't doubt the science that you're raising, but I do know that there still are, and I just did the quick search since 2020, there were 663 quickly identified whole language versus phonics articles. So in the last year, 660 new publications of scholarly reviewed articles on the topic. I think we're just going a little too far to say it's all decided and we have a right answer, and that right answer works for everybody if we all get on the same page. And I'm concerned when I hear that, even though I have no doubt if we were teaching under a whole language and you were system for a long time, those that fall through the cracks of whole language are probably those that don't have the ability to learn under a whole language system. So when you go with phonics with them, they're going to have a different approach. And then I can imagine a similar circumstance where if you have a phonics driven system, then there might be an opportunity for individuals that were not performing well under a phonics driven system to look to a different system, whether that's whole language or something else. And the concern I have is simply the absolute certainty that's being expressed, despite the fact that RTI is a wonderful thing, whether it's RTI or multiple tiered system of supports. These are all incredible. I support the concept. My only caution is we jumped in wrong before. No, fully jumping in, 2 feet, dive in. We love whole language. It seems to me that there's a couple of lessons we should learn there. One is whole language definitely didn't work for everybody. And maybe we don't jump in fully with both feet again, and we remain open to alternatives and to an understanding that students are learning differently. And I know that there is literature now going on about, well, what if we took the best of both? What if we look at some of the concepts in whole language and then understand that those parts of the brain are being fired by the fact that you're looking at the phonics and decoding the words? What if we try and merge some of the key concepts for both and build a better system? And I guess I'm reticent to cut half of the history of reading away and say it was abject failure. What are your thoughts on just kind of keeping a little bit of an open mind?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, I appreciate that information and comments. And I am not going to disagree with you that there are children who learn differently. And I guess my comments are addressed more for the at-risk students. In the regular classroom, students who find it easier to read can read through whole language. They can pick up one of those little readers and read it. So I agree that I do agree. And I'm, like I said, I'm not an expert by any stretch of the means. They can learn using that method, and they can use, a code-based program. Where my concern is with the at-risk students and the, the 35 to 40% or more students who struggle to learn to read. In my experience, they are not going to learn to read using the whole language system. I've seen it too many years where it's not going to work for them. Will it work for the regular classroom kid? Those students who can pick up reading? Yes, you could use that with them. It's like accelerated reader. There are students who love accelerated reader and do very well with it and love the challenges of it. But I have seen too many kids who struggle with learning to read have to use a program like that, which would be a whole language program, and get punished for they didn't meet their goal. I can't tell you how many times I have seen that over the years. So the one thing I do know, as having taught reading instruction for as many years as I have, is that students who are at risk, whole language is not going to work for them. They need more explicit instruction in a code-based language. And so that's where, does that make sense? Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we're going to take one more comment or question, and then we need to move on. We have other folks that are waiting to testify, and we're beyond our time limit. So go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, this question is actually for Shelly. And it's really maybe for PTS. We have a category that is reading interventionists. And is that something that's credentialed at PTSB or required? So I know there's Title I teachers, there's special ed teachers. So fill me in on what we have there for credentials.
Chairman and Representative Summers, I do believe that PTSB has an endorsement for a reading interventionist or reading specialist. That does typically require a university program.
Else in the audience like to testify? Yeah, we'll get to them later. Please introduce yourself. Tell us who you represent.
Thank you, Ms. Hamill. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for your time today. My name is Heather Fleming. As many of you know my husband, Patrick. I am currently a literacy expert and advocate here in Wyoming. Like Patrick, my first career was as a knuckle dragging bond trader partner on Wall Street. My journey changed when our son was an unidentified struggling reader. Since that time, I've had the honor of working on legislative efforts. I've had the honor of partnering with Ms. Hamill and the Department of Education on several literacy-related projects. So I will try to condense my comments given what you just heard and given the time. In 2012, legislation was passed that required screening and identification and proper intervention for struggling readers. So my son was in first grade in 2012. He was not screened. He was not identified. He struggled for years. I kept being told, he's a boy, he'll catch up magically somehow. Boys learn more slowly. He's a late bloomer. And then it sort of shifted to, he really just needs to try a little harder and focus a little more. And you need to lower your expectations. I don't think my kid's a genius. I don't think he's a 15th percentile reader. So, fortunately, Patrick and I have the resources to have spent $3,000 to have him privately evaluated in third grade when he was engaging in self-destructive behavior because he felt so ashamed. And it turns out he's very dyslexic. So I think, the idea that we should legislate some of these things, I think is important. And I think that, I'm not alone in my experience, that we had with our son. So Hayden and I moved to Evergreen, Colorado at that time for him to attend a very expensive private school for dyslexic kids to catch him up. We were separated from Patrick for almost 3 years. This was traumatic, it was expensive, and it was totally avoidable. Had appropriate screening been done and had teachers been empowered, excuse me, with the information to understand the data they were looking at and use it to inform instruction. So I beg your pardon. So after correct intervention, Hayden is now an A student who takes honors classes. So, dyslexia and most reading issues are not intellectual disabilities. Since returning from Colorado, I pursued a master's degree in reading science. I have a degree in dyslexia, and I'm currently in a doctoral program in reading science. So I have really taken this on as a personal mission to try to improve early literacy in Wyoming. My professional goal is to try to bridge the gap between research and practice. Some of that involves legislation, some of it involves professional development, some of it involves changes to university teacher preparation. I also founded a nonprofit to raise money for teacher training. I wanted to put money where my mouth was. In our current project, we raised $40,000 to implement a pre-K program, an evidence-based pre-K program in 2 embedded in schools, preschools in Wyoming. One school serves 100% Native American children. The other school does not. And we wanted to show that if you provide teachers and provide kids with the right kind of early instruction and intervention, in fact, we can move all children up. So in short, I think there are, and I think you've heard this, I think there are 4 areas that, for which we could continue to refine legislation. I want to talk for a second about assessments. And so, you've heard all different assessment terms thrown around. Screeners are meant to be valid and reliable samples of some specific skill, right? So can the child name the alphabet letters and give the alphabet letter sounds? Diagnostic assessments, if you do a screener and it feels like a kid is having some trouble with alphabet letter sounds, a diagnostic assessment kind of double clicks on the screener and tells you exactly what letter sounds the kid's missing, so you can fill those gaps. You then progress monitor those skills. So if a kid is really struggling, once a week, you give them a 1 minute, can they name the alphabet letters probe, right? So that kind of just tells you how you're doing in your instruction. And then YTOP is really a measurement of how have these individual skills translated to general reading, right? To a general outcome measure. YTOP doesn't give you a lot of diagnostic information. It does tell you if individual skills have translated. There is tremendous variability in terms of different assessments, particularly screeners. Pardon me. And so what this means is there's a difference in technical adequacy, which is how valid is the assessment or the subtests and how reliable. Validity is, are we testing what we think we're testing? Reliability is, do we get the same results kind of consistently across time? So the Department of Education did provide a good list of possible assessments to use. There are still many districts who are largely ignoring the legislation writ large, and who are certainly not using any valid or reliable screening assessments. I think everyone gets a little bit of a buy because of COVID in terms of reporting, but even after 2012, districts were unequivocally not reporting what they're supposed to be reporting. So assessments is one piece where I do think the Department of Education could provide a list of approved assessments that are valid and reliable. Any assessment that is technically adequate, let's say it's one of them is FastBridge and one of them is Dibbles, if they both are strong in terms of their statistics about how valid and reliable they are, we really can compare those. So those are sort of apples to apples, but we have to ensure that they're both valid. So I think there are two options. One is we pick and fund one screening assessment. It'd probably be $300 grand a year for all K through 3 kids. It's not super expensive in the grand scheme of things. The other is that the Department of Ed picks 1 or 2 that work. So that's kind of the first area that I think needs a little more clarification. The second is, really differences in comprehensiveness and evidence basis of curricula. So this is what's used in the regular classroom, what's used to help kids in the regular classroom or maybe outside of the classroom who are struggling, and what is used in special education. Again, understanding that we cannot, as a state, dictate curricula. I think there are 2 choices. I think the Department of Ed, again, could evaluate, perhaps hiring an external consultant to guide the process, all curricula, and say, here's an approved list from which you shall pick. Another option, which I think just creates a lot more work for people, is to do what Arkansas did and create an application process. You have to, you have to submit, we have to review, and just that feels like a lot of noise. It will not be my noise. The third is what I think the Department of Ed has done an outstanding job of over the past 2 years, which is providing very strong professional development in the form of this Embracing Literacy Conference. It was, initially it was meant to be a pilot program. COVID complications, it turned into a conference. It's great, very highly attended. I think some of that needs to be required for K-3 teachers and for K-12 special ed teachers. So I think we could also just say every year, just like you have to do something on bloodborne pathogens, you're going to do some training on the most recent reading research. I am very excited about the new leadership at the College of Ed and Dr. Scott Thomas. I think he brings a deep leadership and administrative experience, and I'm hopeful that he is comfortable possibly leading some changes there. I had some answers to some questions that people had asked. I will just talk to you offline so that I can reduce this time. But Representative Nyman, what I do want to address is I think you hit the nail on the head. And this is not specific to University of Wyoming. Nationally, teachers report not being prepared to teach and assess reading. And part of the reason, I think, is that much of the research about reading happens outside of the silo of colleges of education. It happens in neuroscience labs and psychology departments. And so kind of that doesn't always translate into what teachers are being taught. But because it's difficult to influence this, because of academic freedom and tenure, we're put in this position of having to address the results. So not the root problem, but the results of the problem. And that is always more expensive and more complicated, right? So teachers who aren't empowered with what they should be become administrators who select curricula and assessments in PD, and it all just continues to not empower the teacher with what they need. So just in terms of background, and I know we've gone over this, but and these are old YTAP scores, but 45% of our third graders, let's back up to definitions. Proficient is, I can read the words on the page and I can use that information. I can create meaning from it and understand it. Basic is, I can kind of read the words on the page, but not really well enough to use it. Filling out a job application would be tough. So we are not going to celebrate students reading at the basic level. Below basic is, I can't read the words on the page. So the fact that, that these are our numbers of kids reading, 45% is below proficient in third grade, 47% in 10th grade. So we can have all the theoretical discussions we want about sort of whether what we're doing is working, but the percentage of kids reading does not change between third and 10th grade. In fact, it gets worse. So we're doing something not quite right to begin with, and we're doing more of what didn't work the first time through special ed. The NAEP scores differently show that 60% of fourth graders are not reading proficiently, and 66% of eighth graders. So same thing, different scale. The difficulty is that although our scores are at the top and sort of consistent with how much we spend, the average scores across the country are below proficient. So again, are we going to celebrate the fact that we're at the top of a bunch of credit scores? Maybe. I mean, I'm not. Additionally, the US, in terms of global scores, there's a test called a PISA, which is kind of like the NAEP, but for global scores, I think we are 13th. And so, and there are a number of countries who I think, it would probably surprise you to learn are above us. China, Singapore, Macau, Estonia, Canada, Finland, Ireland, South Korea, Poland, New Zealand, and Sweden. So, I mean, yes, we're doing better, but compared to other developed countries, we're not killing it. So early intervention, it's 4 times more effective. A study by a researcher called Fumiko Hef shows this. Waiting 1 year diminishes impact by 25 to 50%. The return on investment based on a study she did was that it's between $16 and $31 for every dollar spent early. Bond trader and me can't help but sort of looking at this from that perspective. And the recalibration consultant told you that 40% of kids in special ed shouldn't be there. They're there because of reading issues that could have been addressed early. And our special ed teachers, that's not their expertise. right? Yet they end up dealing with our most impacted readers. And this is not what they're trained to do. And frankly, they should have more time to spend with the kids who really do need the specialization that they offer. So I think, in summary, I think we are in a place where we can try to identify sort of low-hanging fruit that we can fix, and try to do a Venn diagram of bang for the buck, right? Like, what can we do that doesn't unduly test or burden districts in terms of testing and reporting, that will ultimately reduce referrals to special ed, which will reduce, hopefully, the $19,000, on average that we spend per child in special education.
Questions from the committee? Yes.
Chairman, and let me say I'm among those that is not satisfied to be the best of the worst. And we aren't even really the best of the pile in this country quite. I'm in the process of developing a list of potential reasons that our program is not succeeding. And one of the items on there now is the districts are not taking things seriously. Question for you. When your son was first having troubles, first grade, were you in a Wyoming school district at that point?
Albany County.
Albany County. So one of the ones that is regarded one of our better districts, but it was not getting the job done in this particular area. How much of a problem is it that we just are getting ignored at the school district level on a grand scale? Is it unique to one district, or do you think there are a lot of them?
Chairman and Senator Scott, that's a great question. Thank you. So I think it is because there is so much local control allowed within many districts, sort of down to the school and classroom level. I think it depends on the school. I think some schools have chosen to do a better job of this than others. There are districts, so I sit in a lot of IEP meetings doing pro bono advocacy for families. There are some districts which are more aggressively ignoring the legislation than others. There are some that have made some really good assessment and curricular decisions, but will not insist that it be implemented across the district. So I think some of it is that they're ignoring the legislation. I also think, so I've spent a couple of years getting feedback from districts about what they like in the bill, what they struggle with in the bill, to try to understand how we could make it more implementable, right? Because it has to be useful and not just sort of a check the box, right? And so I think it's a long answer to a specific question. I think some districts are ignoring it. I think there are ways in which we can clarify some language in the bill and create some parameters and a little bit of reporting that I don't think is onerous, that will ensure that it's not being ignored. Does that answer your question? Sure.
Senator Salazar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I have a comment and a question, and we can also talk offline. First of all, I want to commend you for taking command of your own child's education when you realized there was a problem. And my question to you, and again, we can talk offline, is I would love to hear, now that you've been plugged into this almost subculture of parents, have you heard of additional anecdotal stories of parents who were in the same boat that you were? And I would love to hear how widespread that is. It's very concerning for me. And I'm so thankful that you're here today, because I think a couple of us did not know this, and I appreciate it. And but I'd love to hear your answer offline, so thanks.
Sure, thank you for the question.
Other questions? Yes, Representative.
I think Senator Ellis was next. She's had her hand up before.
I just can't see you down there in the end, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we've talked about the training aspect, and I'm aware that Colorado mandated that some of their teachers get literacy training that I think you mentioned or that you envisioned. And that legislation in Colorado passed in 2019, and I think it gave teachers 2022 to get that training done. Do you have any other information about other states that have done that mandate for their teachers? Because we're not alone, Wyoming, like other states are figuring this out too and struggling. Other states, and have you heard, just doing the work that you do, how well that received? I'm guessing that it wasn't initially, but I'm just kind of curious how that story's been playing out in Colorado, or our neighbors to the south. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, and Senator Ellis, thank you for the question. So I have a list of all of that information. I do not have it on the tip of my tongue, but of exactly what, so I have a binder of all of the legislation for every state, K-3 reading, what is required, what is sort of presented like we have done it here that I can share with you. The short answer is there are probably 15 states that are starting to require professional development specifically related to what we're discussing. Many of them were also recipients of the Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grant, which was part of that description in the grant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just a follow-up question. One of my biggest pet peeves is at the end of the school year, I get all the materials and these beautiful workbooks that my kids had at school, that they're completely untouched and in pristine condition. And I wonder why we buy them if we're not going to use them. And so do you think there's value in requiring some administrators who purchase school supplies to take some of the training? I'm just kind of curious of like, is it just the teachers or is there an administrative role to make sure we're buying the right materials? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, the answer is yes. I think the principles, I think, are the, I can't find the vocabulary word, the key to ensuring that the correct materials are purchased and actually used. If you do not have principal buy-in, change is hard, behavior change is hard, curricular change is hard. It's emotional. None of us like change, right? And so you really need a principal who's willing to say, listen, this is hard, we're going to do it. We may decide not to care about YTAP scores this year during this transition, but here is what here are the materials we're going to use. The answer is yes, because they were teachers who never initially received any training in how to evaluate curricular materials or assessments, and then they are put in the position of purchasing them. So the answer is yes. I think administrative training is critical.
Now we'll go to Representative Marshall.
Thank you. Again, thanks for your testimony today and all your work on this. So House Bill 297 a couple of years ago, and you were obviously instrumental in that. And I think Senator Scott co-chaired that, co-sponsored it. And that bill was, enjoyed success from nearly all of the legislature. But I think the big thing, I'm just in my memory, number one, we took the YTOP out of the K-1-2 thing. Little kindergartners touching the iPad, and now you're proficient or not. So we put more of the focus in really on screening, and then those 5 areas, I think, from phonics, phonological awareness, dyslexia, all those things. So is there more? And then we took away the department's ability to select the screener and gave that to the districts, local school boards. And so am I hearing some maybe regret on that part a little bit, on the screener part from you? Are there any more steps that we need on that, I guess, or other areas? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, Representative Harshman, that's a good question. So the reason that the K2 YTOP was removed is because it was not valid or reliable. It was giving no useful, actionable information. As you may recall, Natrona initially brought this bill to you, or this idea to you, because they were using something called FastBridge, which is really a best-in-class screening and progress monitoring tool. And so they were frustrated because they did not feel like the Department of Ed had provided them with a list of screening tools. And so their point was, you haven't done it. It's been 10 years. We don't want you to have that ability anymore. I was hopeful that districts would embrace the kind of list that was given to them of screeners that they could use and actually use them and actually report on the data. It's pretty clear that a lot of them aren't doing that. And so I think it's less about giving control. So I think my impression, and this, you know, I may be misremembering, was it was less about taking the control from the Department of Ed and more about getting rid of K2 YTOP and trying to provide a list of useful tools that are valid and reliable. And so I think that's really the key. If we're going to test kids, and these are the screening tests again are 15 minutes, right? And it's not, it doesn't upset the children. But we want to make sure if we're going to test them that we have good data that we can actually use that tells us something that we can then have, that we can take action on.
So, but aren't, Mr. Chairman, that, I mean, part of the language in that bill, the districts have to report to the department what they are using and all that data. And you're saying that's not happening? Our school districts aren't reporting what screener they're using and how many dyslexic kids they're finding?
I
guess
will
we'd like
defer.
to know what district that is so we can find out.
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Harshman, I think a couple of things happened. The
I
bill
guess
passed.
I think, gosh, I haven't heard that. That's the first I've heard that. I would be stunned that, I think we would hear that if there were half the districts just ignored the law. I just can't believe that.
So I have not seen any evidence that that is happening across, you know, across the state. I think a couple things happened. It passed in January. The Department of Ed guidance came out in October. This is after districts have purchased anything they're going to purchase, you know, in terms of assessments or curricula. COVID hits in January, right? So I think some of it is a continuation of the, like, maybe kind of not really wanting to deal with change. And I think some of it's legitimately COVID. I mean, I think our Department of Ed and our schools, I can't imagine what life was like for them last year, right? So what I have seen in terms of reporting is one cell that says, tell us how many kids in total K through 3 are at risk of reading failure. The Department of Ed did provide a template that was voluntary that you could use to fill in this information. My understanding is most districts chose not to use it. So I think the information they've gotten has been partial, which is, again, I think that's a problem in not making it easy for them. I don't, it's unclear to me how much was willful and how much was simply, we don't really understand what you want us to report, right?
Okay, thank you. I think those things will probably that'll clean itself up. I think, yeah. Overall, though, I think the bill is going to be good. I think partly too, and it goes back to the previous presenter on this whole language issue at Senator office. I don't want to, we experienced that in Natrona as a district of choice for different schools. Some were whole language schools, some were phonics. It was interesting how that whole thing has transitioned over the years. Thank you.
Representative Chairman, may I make one more comment about the whole language?
Sure. Go ahead.
So I think the whole language versus phonics, to your point, Senator Rothfuss, is oversimplified, right? The idea of whole language is that children use context and sometimes pictures to create meaning from text. They use inference. Sometimes they use the first letter of a word, but they essentially infer what the word is. Because of neuroimaging, we know without a shadow of a doubt, it is settled science that is not how the brain becomes skilled at reading, full stop. Is it true that some children will kind of pick up the code more quickly than others and therefore are then able to really read the words and create meaning more quickly? Yes. What is interesting is that there's actually research that shows that kids who are not impacted in reading at all, when they are taught using code-based instruction, they are actually able to access more complex text earlier. So they do just fine with the take a guess, but they actually have stronger skills later. Additionally, the whole language kids can't spell because they're never taught those relationships, right? So kids who seem to be relatively proficient can't spell. And so again, the first, reading is, I got to read the words on the page and I have to comprehend what I read. You have to be able to read the words on the page. And some children, about 60%, require that to be explicitly taught. The ones who don't require that still benefit from it in that they can read more complex text earlier. The parts of whole language in terms of the fact that developing background knowledge and vocabulary, that's true, right? We need good explicit instruction that's engaging in some aspects of what would be kind of in the whole language camp and some aspects of what would be considered in the phonics camp. But again, I think that sort of comparison is intellectually oversimplified. Thank you.
We're running about 30 minutes behind time, and this is obviously a very important topic. It's very close to a lot of people's heart, and I don't resent spending extra time on it, but I'm wondering if maybe we should at our next meeting, maybe have some continuation of this. It seems to me that we probably are not going to be able to thoroughly cover this at the degree we would like to cover it at this particular meeting. So with that, do we have anyone else in the audience that would like to testify? Yes, we have somebody virtually. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, we have Megan Hester, and I've just invited her to the committee's room.
All right, welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Chairman Scott, Chairman Paxton, and members of the committee. My name is Megan Hester, and I am here as a parent of a Wyoming student and on behalf of POWER, Parents of Wyoming Readers. We are a grassroots organization that is growing up from parents who are sharing similar stories to ours across the state. I know Senator Salazar, you had just mentioned an interest in hearing other parents' anecdotal stories. So please go to our website. It's parentsofwyomingreaders.org. There are 4 of us currently listed as parent advocates that are kind of trying to get the ball rolling across the state. And I'm sorry if this gets a little long. I'm going to try to respond to some of the discussion that was had as well. So most of you have heard our story and have heard from my husband before. You'll most likely only be hearing from me from now on. Justin has decided to step out of the ring, so to speak. First, he has been in Evergreen, Colorado for the majority of the last 3 weeks with our son, Grayson, while he attends a dyslexia camp. Second, as a family, we can no longer afford for him to miss any work hours. He's working from home while he's down there. He can't take the time to offer testimony here. This camp and lodging will have cost us $12,000 for 5 weeks when all is said and done. That is $12,000 that we are spending in another state. And add that to the $80 per hour for an out-of-state tutor that we paid for 2 to 3 hours each week this past school year. And we've just about spent what you spend per student out of our own pocket. So what happens if our daughter McKenna isn't taught to read either? How many families can afford to do this? Why do we have to afford to do this? Why aren't our schools teaching all of our kids to read? 95% of the population can be taught to read to proficiency. I was dismissed so quickly by a teacher for suspecting dyslexia, just because the teacher wasn't taught what it really looks like, what the red flags are. Ultimately, for the school to take us seriously, we had to get a formal diagnosis, which was another $3,000 spent out of state for anyone keeping track. I can tell you that there are a lot of red flags, and going down a list, my 2 children have an equal number of them, and none of them are the same. But if I can read that list, so can a teacher. So can a university professor who is teaching the next generation of teachers. The ones who can't read that list are the dyslexic parents who slipped through the cracks as kids themselves and now may have dyslexic children because there is a genetic component. What you may not know about our family is that I have now almost completed the first half of a graduate program in reading science. So I know that what will teach my children how to read will also teach your children and grandchildren, learning disabled or not. My kids may need extra time with the material and a trained interventionist, but it's the same material. And to Senator Rothfuss's point, it is not just phonics, it is structured literacy. And that is the best of both worlds. That is phonics, that is the background knowledge and the vocabulary and the comprehension out of balance literacy. And to Chairman Paxton's question earlier about kindergarten readiness and if it's being assessed well at the school district level. My daughter, with all of her red flags, nearly aced her kindergarten readiness evaluation this summer. It is why the continued assessment piece and the monitoring is so important, because she is going to hit a wall at some point in her education if the teachers can't do what they need to. And so I need them to catch her as soon as she starts to fall. The assessments that will tell you if my children or your children need that extra help are the same ones that will help any teacher place her entire class in small groups for differentiated instruction, which is something they already do. What our teachers need to know is what the assessments that they give kids are telling them and what to do with the information.
I'm not sure if you can hear us, but
Are you there? Oh no, I froze. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
again now, Megan.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to stop my video and hope that that gives me enough bandwidth.
Okay.
I'm not sure where I cut out on you though. Can anybody kind of help me out where you lost me?
What was? Oh, assessments.
About the assessments.
Okay. So the assessments that will tell you if my children or your children and grandchildren need the extra help are the same ones that help a teacher place her entire class in small groups for differentiated instruction, which is something they already tried to do. What our teachers need to know is what the assessments that they're giving kids tell them and what to do with that information. You have to know where kids are coming from to meet them where they are. Now, the other gap in the assessment piece that I have seen from the parent side is that the schools are not required to notify parents if their child is identified. It should go without saying, but it's a loophole that might leave parents in the dark. It's fine if the school can remediate the reading struggle, but what a huge mess if they can't. To Representative Summers' point earlier, I'd like to address what's happened in Laramie County School District 1 as far as resources. Only Title I schools in this district have a full-time reading interventionist. The interventionist at my son's school split with another, and as such, only had time to see 4 students per grade and missed an entire grade at each school because of scheduling. If even only 10% of the students are dyslexic, she was not able to see them all. Our district has also just voted to cut professional development in the budget. I don't know how far they've cut it, but they have cut it from what it was. And we were only spending 60% of what your model says is appropriate to start with. I'm extremely happy that the WDE can provide letters training and other opportunities in the absence of that, because our district specifically is going to need that. The assessments are short, as they've said before, 5 to 15 minutes, depending on the familiarity of the teacher in giving it and the grade of the students. Any assessment worth its salt won't be giving the same types or levels of screeners to the kindergartners that they do the second graders. It's a scale of tests that are designed by psychologists to be appropriate for each age. They have also validated the test by giving it to so many at each stage of each grade that they know what the average score is to predict future success. They can literally give you a percentage of likelihood that a child will succeed based on their score. It's incredibly accurate. It tells you that my son only has a 10 to 20% chance of learning how to read on the current course of intervention as of the end of the school year. And to someone's point earlier, we have read to him every day of his life. Chairman Scott, in response to your question of the WE about the screener data, the Laramie County School District 1 gave a screener to their K-3 students just before COVID. They identified 48% as at risk for dyslexia or other reading difficulties. That is 1,901 students in K-3. And that was before COVID. Depending on what researcher you ask, 10 to 20% of the population is dyslexic. The way we are teaching our kids has them so far behind, they look like they're dyslexic, whether they are or not. What are the YTOP and NAEP scores going to look like in a few years at this rate? We must make our schools do better. We must train our teachers better. It is your job to protect the citizens of this state, and that includes our Wyoming students. As Maya Angelou said, you do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Thank you for your time.
Questions from the committee?
Chairman.
Representative Harsh.
Thank you, Ms. Hess, for your testimony, and really appreciate all your work. And I wanted to ask Heather this as well. I mean, hasn't part of this too, dyslexia used to be like a medical diagnosis. I mean, it wasn't really in the school. It was more, I mean, so we're starting to learn more and change a little bit. Maybe can you give us a little kind of history of that, how we're starting to learn more about these percentages of children who are dyslexic?
Go ahead.
If I can, I think I'm going to let Heather take that one.
Chairman Representative Harshman. So that's a great question. It still is a medical diagnosis. It would be like someone diagnosing, cancer, right? Like it has to be done by typically a psychologist who's qualified and trained. However, just like other medical issues, there are symptoms that present very clearly and very persistently that we know eventually present as dyslexia or the difficulty learning to read. So we are learning more about the brains of dyslexic children. In short, non-dyslexic brains process language in the left hemisphere. When they do functional MRIs of children with dyslexia, the language processing actually happens in the right hemisphere, which is not meant for language processing and doesn't do so efficiently. So IQ is here, right? Language processing, and most of us is here, dyslexics, it's here. The fascinating thing is that when there is intensive explicit instruction for dyslexic kids, they see a rewiring to the left hemisphere. They see a thickening of the myelin sheath, which is like out on the outside of the nerve that allows the signals to go faster. So again, we know, it used to be sort of, we just knew symptoms. Now we can actually connect brain images to symptoms. And when we have that list of symptoms, persistent difficulty with X, Y, and Z, we can say this child looks like they have red flags. They look like they have risk factors. We are never asking the school to diagnose dyslexia.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on that, I think the term dyslexia is become like synonymous with reading disability. And I think that that's just something I hear from parents when they express concern to their teachers or their district. They say, I think my kid has dyslexia. And to a person who's trained and knows that that's a medical diagnosis, they'll say, no, you don't know that. But I think, it would be, we'd be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't kind of recognize. I think that's how the public, they use that term for any kind of reading difficulty. Do you think that that's a fair way, or in your experience in the work you do, is that a fair statement?
Chairman and Senator Ellis, I think there is a lack of understanding about what dyslexia is and what it is not. And it's actually not that complicated to present a teacher with sort of a half an hour of, this is what it looks like. Here are some formal measures. Here are some observational measures, right? A child who looks like their handwriting is written with their toes, who has trouble retrieving their words, who is below benchmark in the screening assessments, who can't tell a story in a straight line, who is gone every time there's reading, right? There are behavioral and there's data that we can use to pretty concisely articulate what it looks like at different ages. I do think that there's a perception that it's used as a catch-all when in fact it's actually pretty specific. A kid who's reversing their B's and D's in the absence of anything else, is not dyslexic, right?
Mr. Chairman, a follow-up if I may. I mean it in the sense of, maybe parents are trying to advocate for their children and aren't using the right words and are getting penalized for it, when I think those folks that should have a little more compassion. Like, you're expressing a concern about your child. I'm going to take it serious, and maybe you're not using the right term, mom and dad, but I get your concern. So that's the thing I've heard knocking on doors in my district, is parents trying to advocate for their children only to be told, well, they don't have dyslexia, and they don't, but they do have reading difficulty. So I think we could all be doing a better job of kind of bridging the gap of that term and how we use it as a society, not just in academia or in science.
Chairman, Senator Ellis, the issue, when a parent comes and is concerned, because again, we are not empowering our teachers with information about different reading difficulties. Dyslexia is the most common by a long shot, but we're not empowering them to know what it is. And so they, of course, naturally go, no, everything, but yes, I think I have been working on some parent professional development on this topic to say, like, here's how you can distinguish, right? Like there are signs as early as 3, right? But here's like, please know that when you use that term, this is what it means, and give them the words to express exactly the behaviors they're seeing instead of necessarily just always using that word. I think you're right.
Co-Chairman Scott, and let's keep in mind we've totally ruined our schedule for the day, and keep in mind that we've hit such a hot topic that we really do need to continue this at some point in time. So let's try to keep this as brief as we can. I know we have people online that are waiting for this afternoon's and the rest of this morning's topic. So let's try to be respectful of the time and do the best job we can, with the thought in mind that we're going to bring this topic back up at the next meeting. It requires a lot more thought than what we've allotted time for today. So just keep that in mind as we move forward.
Mr. Chairman, what I took out of the last conversation was there are a number of reading disabilities that are not technically dyslexia. There's something else. Do you have any quantitative feel for, you said dyslexia was the most common. How, are there a whole series of others? What percentage of the population that's not learning how to read has some different kind of reading disability or problem?
Chairman and Senator Scott, it's a long answer, which I am happy to do now or later. Dyslexia, according to research, impacts somewhere between 9 and 20% of people, kind of on a continuum. In special ed, about 40% of kids are in special ed under this category called specific learning disability. About 80% of those kids are dyslexic. So the bulk of kids in special ed are in fact dyslexic. These are ones who are so far behind they've actually qualified for special ed. Other things that can impact reading are environment, dialect, second language, not growing up in a household in which you are read to and there's a lot of rich oral language. However, all of that is remediatable kind of by 2nd grade if you have teachers who really understand how to teach vocabulary and develop background knowledge. Dyslexia is, so it's also a longer conversation, but the short answer is it is an enormous part of our special ed budget.
I believe it was Representative Conley. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, do we have anyone else virtually? Okay, obviously we're going to have to continue this at a future date. We'll mark that on our calendar and make sure that we have adequate time to address it next time. Extremely important topic and the basis for all learning, and so understandably there's a lot of interest in that. And, with that, I believe we will thank our folks, our presenters, and our folks from the audience that had to comment, and have a short break of about 10 minutes, and we'll try to get back or closer to being on time. Thank you. hopefully we'll get a quorum here with the committee pretty soon. Gentlemen, ladies, feel free to remove your jackets if it's a little warm in here. We're going to be a little informal, so if it's a little too warm for you in here, feel free to take your jacket off. I've already gone there, as you can tell. Before we call the university folks forward, I think Co-Chair Scott has a comment or suggestion he'd like to make to kind of put not a period, but maybe a dash on this, because we're going to continue this conversation at our next meeting. So, yeah, Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I would say at the outset that I'm very gratified with the interest in this committee on this topic, which I think is one of the fundamental things we need to do in improving our K-12 system and improving the results. What I've got a request is for each committee member to go home and pick either your home school district or one of the districts in your one school districts in your legislative district that's handy, and go to it, talk to, and you may have to wait until school's in, but talk to some of the teachers that are teaching K through 3, teaching the reading, talk to maybe some of the specialists, principal or two, and somebody from your administration, and figure out to what extent is your district complying with the requirements of the statute. What are they actually doing to improve the reading results on their kids, and kind of be prepared to come back and say, what is it working in your district, or is there some problem? I suspect a lot of districts there is some problem. Try to figure out what it is. I've got a list now of at least 4 hypotheses for why we're not getting the results after 20 years from passing the initial legislation, where we're not getting the results we should be. Teachers not properly trained, not identifying enough children, not adequately individualizing the treatments, districts not taking this whole thing seriously. All those are on the list. I'm sure I've missed some, but if we could get, I can't require it, but if every member could make a point of talking to their school district and talk to a sample enough so that you get some picture as to what's going on in your area, because I think we're going to see some variety, and do it as preparation for really the next meeting and the meeting after that. Our next meeting is when, Mr. Chairman?
Oh, September. When is that?
Mr. Chairman, your next committee meeting's September 8th and 9th in Casper.
9th in Casper. Okay, we may not get it done by then, but I would also ask, I'm going to take a project on of trying to figure out on a more statewide level, in addition to talking to my district, what's going wrong, what do we need to remedy, and I'd be interested in getting 2 or 3 volunteers, to maybe some with some experience with some of the organizations, or how organizations work and how you manage things, to see if we can figure out what do we need to change in order to get this to work better. But I think this is something the whole committee's interested in. And I really would ask the whole committee to go look at your local school district, at least your local district, and see what's going on there, so that we have a broad basis of understanding of what the districts are and aren't doing.
Okay, thank you. I also appreciate the robust discussion we had on the topic, very near to our hearts. Just as a warning, we will be breaking after the University of Wyoming, after we hear from the folks from the University of Wyoming, for 1 hour for lunch, and try to make up some time. So with that, we'd like to welcome our representatives from the University of Wyoming forward, and please introduce yourselves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the entire committee. I'm Ed Seidel, the new president, not so new anymore, but new as of a year ago, of the University of Wyoming. And I've gotten to know a number of you, but I would say in the last year, I've spent way too much time behind a computer screen instead of being out in beautiful Wyoming and getting to know you better personally. So I commit to being able to do that more, much more going forward. And all of us will. I think this is just a sign of that right here. I'll introduce my colleagues and friends here in a minute, but I want to just make a couple remarks and some observations. So I'm not an expert in the science of learning or particularly child literacy, but it's kind of in my family. My dad was an educational psychologist. My daughter's a second grade teacher, so I talk a lot with her about it. My partner, Gabrielle, was a associate dean for research at the College of Education in Illinois and spent a lot of time on this. So while I don't have specific expertise, but we do in our university, of course, I think about these issues a lot. And this morning's session has just reminded me of the awesome responsibility we have for the state, the future of the state. And if you heard our presentations to the Board of Trustees last week, or if you just get to know me, you know that I am absolutely dedicated to the university having as much impact as is possible on the state of Wyoming, both in terms of developing the workforce and also the economic development aspects that we can take sort of a stronger leadership role in. Another part of it is that we're committed to partnerships. And so we've been working very closely with the community colleges. We will be working more closely with the Wyoming Department of Education and school districts on topics that we're talking about this morning. So it's just a general commitment. I wanted to point out something this morning's session, particularly on the science of learning and how you have different theories that sort of come and then they may go or they may come back and so on. It reminded me of a session I had with the National Science Board about 10 years ago. I was at the National Science Foundation, and we had a presentation by some of the most esteemed educators or researchers into education in the country. And they were there presenting, and the basic story went like this. We had some hypotheses about how people learn. We studied them for 10 years. They were wrong. We have some new hypotheses. And so there is an evolution here. And I was really pondering this morning because I was there with three colleagues of mine who are good friends now. I was the head of math and physical sciences, but others represented. There were head of education, where the science of education is actually studied and funded out of NSF. The head of computer science and head of geosciences. All four of us are now university presidents: Carnegie Mellon, Illinois, Maine, and Wyoming here. And it just really struck me how much responsibility we have to address the topics, regardless of what the underlying theories are of the science of learning. And I was thinking, if you look at some regions, either other states or other countries, they may consistently do better than we're doing right now in terms of education outcomes, in particular for reading, regardless of what the underlying theories are. So I think there's a lot that we can do in addition to understanding what are the best methodologies, so into policy and cultural issues. And so anyway, I personally want to spend some more time with it going forward. So let me take a minute and introduce my colleagues here. So we have to my right, Kevin Carmen, who is our new dean, new provost and executive vice president. And he is highly experienced, having been a provost for 8 years at the University of Nevada at Reno, where he had many accomplishments, including increasing educational outcomes at the university level, retention and graduation rates improved, diversity of the student body improved. Many techniques he either adopted or developed there we'll be looking at here to improve our own educational outcomes. Also raising the research profile of the university from a Carnegie R2 to R1, which is the highest level of research activity, an aspiration that we have at the University of Wyoming for multiple reasons. But the top two reasons for wanting to do that are more research activity leads to better teaching and better student outcomes if you involve students in that, which we would. And B, it allows us to generate new revenue streams, which is extremely important as we all face declining budgets, not just in Wyoming, but across the country. State budgets are hit. So we want to grow our different revenue streams, and by having research activities, that will help us tremendously. So I'll let Kevin speak in a minute on his background as well. And then we have a new dean of the College of Education. And so, in fact, we have people who've been here for roughly a week, a month, and a year. So we're all relatively new, but all fully dedicated to the outcome. So our new dean of education is Scott Thomas, who has come to us from the University of Vermont as formerly as the dean of College of Education. And he had a couple of other gigs as dean of College of Education too. So we have enormous experience. And this is another commitment I think we have from the University of Wyoming to bring in the best leadership from across the country to help lead the university going forward. And I think this is an example of our commitment to do that. So if it's all right, I would just like to have my colleagues make a few remarks as well.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, President Seidel. I'll be brief, but I will say that this committee is extremely important, obviously to the state, and our relationship with the university is extremely important. I come from a family of teachers. Both of my parents were teachers. I have two sisters. Both of them are teachers. One is a special ed teacher. So this all resonates very strongly with me. I've been at two previous institutions. I was at LSU for 24 years, the last 9 years as Dean of the College of Science. And as you heard, the last 8 years at the University of Nevada, Reno. In both of those programs, we developed really what I think were innovative secondary ed STEM education programs. They modeled a You Teach program, if you heard of that, from the University of Texas. But the commitment to education and having well-trained teachers is deeply ingrained in me. And you have my commitment that it will be a high priority. To my right here, Dr. Thomas, I happen to be coming on board just as the interviews were occurring for the dean position at University of Wyoming, and had the opportunity to meet with all of the candidates. And it was a very strong pool of candidates, I will say that. But having said that, Dr. Thomas was the clear top choice among the stakeholders in the College of Education and everybody who had interactions with the candidates. Scott and I are off to a great start. He comes with a great deal of energy and experience, and I know that he is deeply committed to moving Wyoming forward. And I'm sure that I know that he was taking copious notes during the meeting here this morning. So I'm very excited about what lies ahead for us. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Thomas.
Thank you, Provost Carmen, Mr. Chairman. It's a delight to be here. I have to say that this is the single most deliberate professional decision I have made in my lifetime to come to Wyoming. This morning's robust conversation was totally affirming of that commitment, and it was completely energizing for our work going forward. So I thank you for the warm welcome, as unintentional as it might have been. It was wonderful. I've had a chance to spend time at a retreat with the PTSB group. I look forward to meeting the Board of Education. Superintendent Balo and I have had a discussion. We're off on the right foot to connect the college and the university with the Department of Education on important initiatives that relate to, among other things, work that we're talking about this morning. I will also state very clearly that the focus of the college is tightening. It will tighten on the provision of the highest quality teachers for the state of Wyoming as a first priority. As part of that priority, it will rely on the most engaging field experiences for our teacher candidates in our program across Wyoming, not just within the locales of Albany County. And then this morning's conversation about the preparation of educators and whatnot was very important, but the piece that wasn't tightly coupled to that, but was touched on multiple times, was in-service training, professional development for our existing teachers. And we don't stop when our graduates leave our campus. And it's my vision. I don't know whether we'll pull it off, but together we're going to work toward coming up with something that looks like a lifetime guarantee to our graduates from the College of Education. You graduate, you can always come back. We'll train our expertise on the problems in your schools and your communities and your work with your families and your students. So it's my hope that we'll achieve that as a College of Education going forward. Also, you know that we're very involved across the state with the Trustees Education Initiative.
and we're not as involved as I would hope we would be. So we will be endeavoring to be more geographically present across the state. That will be in a variety of different forms, but I assure you that we will be connecting with your constituents and your districts to provide the resources and gain the knowledge that we need to do our work as best we can. I would also say that with the university restructuring that has been proposed and that is currently going through a review process internally, we are moving, there's proposal to move the other components of early childhood education, the human development piece of this, from College of Agriculture to the College of Education, which would provide us with a more cohesive unit to focus on the issues that we're looking at this morning. So there's great intellectual promise with the proposal that's on the table within the university that will provide us with greater capacity and greater expertise to train on many of the issues that you're raising this morning. And finally, I would say that I am committed to traveling the state from to all corners and the middle. I don't know exactly how to parse this geographically. Small state with long roads. I come from Vermont, which is a small state with short roads, but we'll see how that maps on to Wyoming. But I will be seeking out each and every one of you when I make it to your area of the state. And hopefully you can provide me with connections to constituents who will be important for our work together through the college, the university, and this committee. So thank you very much for your time this morning.
Well, thank all of you for showing your interest in this, in the education kids of Wyoming, and for coming and joining us here today. And as you heard earlier, we have many challenges, and you just heard a few of the things facing us, and we're doing this with limited budget now. And so we are trying to be as creative and innovative as we can, and preserve the delivery system and improve the delivery system that we have here in Wyoming for all of our kids. We know that you will be strong partners in seeing that we get that done. So thank you again for coming today, and we're looking forward to getting to meet you better and get acquainted with you better. And certainly hope you enjoy your tours around Wyoming, and don't forget the Red Desert. You know, that's a good share of my district. I cover most of the south central Wyoming, so bigger than most of the states in the United States. So thank you again, gentlemen, for attending. And we're going to take a lunch break now. Let's see, it's 11:52. Let's do that afterwards. Okay, and so we will resume in 1 hour from now, and see if we can't get a little bit caught up on our schedule. So